Bleak House, Chapter 1. In Chancery. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Fiddlesticks. London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus, 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill, smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes, gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs, undistinguishable in the mire, horses scarcely better, splashed to their very blinkers, foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper, and losing their foothold at street corners where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke, if this day ever broke, adding new deposits to the crust upon crust of mud, sticking at these points tenaciously to the pavement and accumulating at compound interest. Fog everywhere, fog up the river where it flows among green aits and meadows, fog down the river where it rolls defiled among the tiers of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city, fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners, wheezing by the firesides of their wards, fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper down in his close cabin, fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck, chance people on the bridges peeping over the parapets into another sky of fog, with fog all round them, as if they were up in a balloon and hanging in the misty clouds. Gas looming through the fog in divers places in the streets, much as the sun may, from the spongy fields, be seen looming by husbandman and ploughboy. Most of the shops lighted 2 hours before their time, as the gas seems to know, for it has a haggard and unwilling look. The raw afternoon is rawest, and the dense fog is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest near that leaden-headed old obstruction, appropriate ornament for the threshold of a leaden-headed old corporation, Temple Bar, and hard by Temple Bar in Lincoln's Inn Hall, at the very heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor in his High Court of Chancery. Never can there come fog too thick, never can there come mud and mire too deep, to assort with the groping and floundering condition which his High Court of Chancery, most pestilent of hoary sinners, holds this day in the sight of heaven and earth. On such an afternoon, if ever, the Lord High Chancellor ought to be sitting here, as here he is, with a foggy glory round his head, softly fenced in with crimson cloth and curtains, addressed by a large advocate with great whiskers, a little voice, and an interminable brief, and outwardly directing his contemplation to the lantern in the roof, where he can see nothing but fog. On such an afternoon some score of members of the High Court of Chancery Bar ought to be, as here they are, mistily engaged in one of the 10,000 stages of an endless cause, tripping one another up on slippery precedents, groping knee-deep in technicalities, running their goat-hair and horsehair warded heads against the walls of words, and making a pretense of equity with serious faces, as players might. On such an afternoon the various solicitors in the cause, some 2 or 3 of whom have inherited it from their fathers, who made a fortune by it, ought to be, as are they not, ranged in a line in a long matted well, but you might look in vain for truth at the bottom of it, between the register's red table and the silk gowns, with bills, cross-bills, answers, rejoinders, injunctions, affidavits, issues, references to masters, reports, mountains of costly nonsense piled before them. Well may the court be dim, with wasted candles here and there. Well may the fog hang heavy in it, as if it would never get out, Well may the stained glass windows lose their colour and admit no light of day into the place. Well may the uninitiated from the streets, who peep in through the glass panes in the door, be deterred from entrance by its owlish aspect, and by the drawl languidly echoing to the roof from the padded dais where the Lord High Chancellor looks into the lantern that has no light in it, and where the attendant wigs are all stuck in a fog bank. This is the Court of Chancery, which has its decaying houses and its blighted lands in every shire, which has its worn-out lunatic in every madhouse, and its dead in every churchyard, which has its ruined suitor with his slipshod heels and threadbare dress borrowing and begging through the round of every man's acquaintance, which gives to moneyed might the means abundantly of wearying out the right, which so exhausts finances, patience, courage, hope, so overthrows the brain and breaks the heart, that there is not an honourable man among its practitioners who would not give, who does not often give, warning, suffer any wrong that can be done you rather than come here. Who happened to be the Lord Chancellor's court this murky afternoon, besides the Lord Chancellor, the counsel in the cause, 2 or 3 counsel who are never in any cause, and the well of solicitors before mentioned? There is the registrar below the judge, in wig and gown, and there are 2 or 3 maces, or petty bags, or privy purses, or whatever they may be, in legal court suits. These are all yawning, for no crumb of amusement ever falls from Jarndyce and Jarndyce, the cause in hand, which was squeezed dry years upon years ago. The shorthand writers, the reporters of the court, and the reporters of the newspapers invariably decamp with the rest of the regulars when Jarndyce and Jarndyce comes on. Their places are blank. Standing on a seat at the side of the hall, the better to peer into the curtained sanctuary, is a little mad old woman in a squeezed bonnet, who is always in court from its sitting to its rising, and always expecting some incomprehensible judgment to be given in her favour. Some say she really is or was a party to a suit, but no one knows for certain, because no one cares. She carries some small litter in a reticule, which she calls her documents, principally consisting of paper, matches, and dry lavender. A sallow prisoner has come up in custody for the half-dozenth time to make a personal application to purge himself of his contempt, which, being a solitary surviving executor who has fallen into a state of conglomeration about accounts of which it is not pretended that he had ever any knowledge, he is not at all likely ever to do. In the meantime his prospects in life are ended. Another ruined suitor, who periodically appears from Shropshire, and breaks out into efforts to address the Chancellor at the close of the day's business, and who can by no means be made to understand that the Chancellor is legally ignorant of his existence after making it desolate for a quarter of a century, plants himself in a good place and keeps an eye on the judge, ready to call out "My lord" in a voice of sonorous complaint on the instant of his rising. A few lawyers, clerks, and others who know this suitor by sight linger on the chance of his furnishing some fun and enlivening the dismal weather a little. Jarndyce and Jarndyce drones on. The scarecrow of a suit has, in course of time, become so complicated that no man alive knows what it means. The parties to it understand it least, but it has been observed that no 2 chancery lawyers can talk about it for 5 minutes without coming to a total disagreement as to all the premises. Innumerable children have been born into the cause, innumerable young people have married into it, innumerable old people have died out of it. Scores of persons have deliriously found themselves made parties in Jarndyce and Jarndyce, without knowing how or why. Whole families have inherited legendary hatreds with the suit. The little plaintiff or defendant, who was promised a new rocking horse when Jarndyce and Jarndyce should be settled, has grown up, possessed himself of a real horse, and trotted away into the other world. Fair wards of court have faded into mothers and grandmothers. A long procession of chancellors has come and gone out. The legion of bills in the suit has been transformed into mere bills of mortality. There are not 3 Jarndyces left upon the earth, perhaps, since old Tom Jarndyce in despair blew his brains out at a coffee-house in Chancery Lane, but Jarndyce and Jarndyce still drags its dreary length before the court, perennially helpless. Jarndyce and Jarndyce has passed into a joke. That is the only good that has ever come of it. But it is a joke in the profession. Every master in Chancery has had a reference out of it. Every Chancellor was in it for somebody or other, when he was counsel at the bar. Good things have been said about it by blue-nosed, bulbous-shoed old benchers in select port wine committee after dinner in hall. Articled clerks have been in the habit of fleshing their legal wit upon it. The last Lord Chancellor handled it neatly when, correcting Mr. Blowers, the eminent silk gown, who said that such a thing might happen when the sky rained potatoes, he observed, "Or when we get through Jarndyce and Jarndyce, Mr. Blowers," a pleasantry that particularly tickled the maces, bags, and purses. How many people out of the suit Jarndyce and Jarndyce has stretched forth its unwholesome hand to spoil and corrupt would be a very wide question. From the master upon whose impaling files reams of dusty warrants in Jarndyce and Jarndyce have grimly writhed into many shapes, down to the copying clerk in the 6 clerk's office who has copied his tens of thousands of Chancery folio pages under that eternal heading, no man's nature has been made better by it. In trickery, evasion, procrastination, spoliation, botheration, under false pretenses of all sorts, there are influences that can never come to good. The very solicitors' boys who have kept the wretched suitors at bay by protesting time out of mind that Mr. Chisel, Mizzle, or otherwise, was particularly engaged and had appointments until dinner, may have got an extra moral twist and shuffle into themselves out of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. The receiver in the cause has acquired a goodly sum of money by it, but has acquired too a distrust of his own mother and a contempt for his own kind. Chisel, Mizzle, and otherwise have lapsed into a habit of vaguely promising themselves that they will look into that outstanding little matter and see what can be done for Drizzle, who was not well used, when Jarndyce and Jarndyce shall be got out of the office. Shirking and sharking, in all their many varieties, have been sown broadcast by the ill-fated cause, and even those who have contemplated its history from the outermost circle of such evil have been insensibly tempted into a loose way of letting bad things alone to take their own bad course, and a loose belief that if the world go wrong, it was in some offhand manner never meant to go right. Thus, in the midst of the mud and at the heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor in his High Court of Chancery. "Mr. Tangle," says the Lord High Chancellor, latterly something restless under the eloquence of that learned gentleman. "M'lud," says Mr. Tangle, "Mr. Tangle knows more of Jarndyce and Jarndyce than anybody. He is famous for it, supposed never to have read anything else since he left school. Have you nearly concluded your argument?" "M'lud, no variety of points. Feel it my duty to submit, Ludship," is the reply that slides out of Mr. Tangle. "Several members of the bar are still to be heard, I believe," says the Lord Chancellor with a slight smile. 18 of Mr. Tangle's learned friends, each armed with a little summary of 1800 sheets, bob up like 18 hammers in a pianoforte, make 18 bows, and drop into their 18 places of obscurity. "We will proceed with the hearing on Wednesday fortnight," says the Chancellor, "for the question at issue is only a question of costs, a mere bud on the forest of tree of the parent suit, and really will come to a settlement one of these days." The Chancellor rises, the bar rises, the prisoner is brought forward in a hurry. The man from Shropshire cries, "My lord!" Maces, bags, and purses indignantly proclaim silence and frown at the man from Shropshire. "In reference," proceeds the Chancellor, still on Jarndyce and Jarndyce, "to the young girl—" "Beg Ludship's pardon, boy," says Mr. Tangle prematurely. "In reference," proceeds the Chancellor with extra distinctness, "to the young girl and boy, the 2 young people," Mr. Tangle crushed, "whom I directed to be in attendance today, and who are now in my private room, I will see them and satisfy myself as to the expediency of making the order for their residing with their uncle." Mr. Tangle, on his legs again, "Beg Ludship's pardon, dead, with their—" Chancellor looking through his double eyeglass at the paper on his desk, "grandfather. Beg Ludship's pardon, victims of rash action, brains." Suddenly, a very little counsel with a terrific bass voice arises, fully inflated in the back settlements of the fog, and says, "Will your lordship allow me? I appear for him. He is a cousin, several times removed. I am not at the moment prepared to inform the court in what exact remove he is a cousin, but he is a cousin." Leaving this address, delivered like a sepulchral message ringing in the rafters of the roof, the very little counsel drops, and the fog knows him no more. Everybody looks for him. Nobody can see him. "I will speak with both the young people," says the Chancellor anew, "and satisfy myself on the subject of their residing with their cousin. I will mention the matter tomorrow morning when I take my seat." The Chancellor is about to bow to the bar when the prisoner is presented. Nothing can possibly come of the prisoner's conglomeration but his being sent back to prison, which is soon done. The man from Shropshire ventures another remonstrative "My lord," but the Chancellor, being aware of him, has dexterously vanished. Everybody else quickly vanishes too. A battery of blue bags is loaded with heavy charges of papers and carried off by clerks. The little mad old woman marches off with her documents. The empty court is locked up. If all the injustice it has committed and all the misery it has caused could only be locked up with it, and the whole burnt away in a great funeral pyre, why, so much the better for other parties than the parties in Jarndyce and Jarndyce. End of Bleak House, Chapter 1. In Chancery, by Charles Dickens.
The Code Napoleon, or the French Civil Code, literally translated from the original and official edition, published in Paris in 1804 by a barrister of the Inner Temple, London, 1827. Preliminary title. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. The French Civil Code. Preliminary title. Of the publication, effect, and application of the laws in general. Decreed 5th of March, 1803. Promulgated 15th of the same month. Article 1. The laws are executory throughout the whole French territory, by virtue of the promulgation thereof made by the First Council. They shall be executed in every part of the Republic, from the moment at which their promulgation can have been known. The promulgation made by the First Council shall be taken to be known in the department which shall be the seat of government, one day after the promulgation, and in each of the other departments, after the expiration of the same interval augmented by 1 day, for every 10 myriameters, about 20 ancient leagues, between the town in which the promulgation shall have been made and the chief place of each department. 2. The law ordains for the future only. It has no retrospective operation. 3. The laws of police and public security bind all the inhabitants of the territory. Immovable property, although in the possession of foreigners, is governed by the French law. The laws relating to the condition and privileges of persons govern Frenchmen, although residing in a foreign country. 4. The judge who shall refuse to determine under pretext of the silence, obscurity, or insufficiency of the law, shall be liable to be proceeded against as guilty of a refusal of justice. 5. The judges are forbidden to pronounce, by way of general and legislative determination, on the causes submitted to them. 6. Private agreements must not contravene the laws, which concern public order and good morals. End of the Code Napoleon, or the French Civil Code. Preliminary title.
Cradock Nowell, A Tale of the New Forest, Volume 1, Chapter 1, by Richard Doddridge Blackmore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Within the New Forest, and not far from its western boundary, as defined by the second perambulation of the good King Edward I, stands the old mansion of the Nowells, the Hall of Nowelhurst. Not content with mere exemption from all feudal service, their estate claims privileges both by grant and custom. The benefit of more fall trees in 6 walks of the forest, the right of digging marl, the turbary illimitable common of pannage, and licence of drawing ackermust, pastime even of hawking over some parts of the crown land, all these would be catalogued as claims quite indefeasible, if the old estates come to the hammer, through the events that form my story. With many of these privileges the royal commissioners will deal in a spirit of scant courtesy, when the Nowell influence is lost in the neighbouring boroughs. But as yet these claims have not been treated like those of some poor commoners. "Pooh, pooh, my man, don't be preposterous. You know as well as I do, these gipsy freedoms were only allowed to balance the harm the deer did. And if the rights of that ancient family are ever called in question, some there are which will require a special act to abolish them. For Charles II, of merry memory, saddened somewhat of late years, espied among the maids of honour an uncommonly pretty girl, whose name was Frances Nowell. He suddenly remembered, what had hitherto quite escaped him, how old Sir Cradock Nowell, beautiful Fanny's father, had saved him from a pike–thrust during Cromwell's crowning mercy. In gratitude, of course, for this, he began to pay most warm attentions to the Hampshire maiden. He propitiated that ancient knight with the only boon he craved hitherto all in vain, a plenary grant of easements in the neighbourhood of his home. Soon as the charter had received the royal seal and signature, the old gentleman briskly thrust it away in the folds of his velvet mantle. Then taking the same view of gratitude which his liege and master took, home he went without delay, to secure his privileges. When the king heard of his departure, without any kissing of hands, he was in no wise disconcerted. It was the very thing he had intended. But when he heard that lovely Fanny was gone in the same old rickety coach, even ere he began to whisper, and with no leave of the Queen, his Majesty swore his utmost for nearly half an hour. Then, having spent his fury, he laughed at the sell, as he would have called it, if the slang had been invented, and turned his royal attention to another of his wife's young maidens. Nowelhurst Hall looks too respectable for any loose doings of any sort. It stands well away from the weeping of trees, like virtue shy of sentiment, and therefore has all the wealth of foliage shed, just where it pleases, around it. From a rising ground the house has sweet view of all the forest changes, and has seen 300 springs wake in glory, and 300 autumns waning. Spreading away from it wider slopes the Chase, as they call it, with great trees stretching paternal arms in the vain attempt to hold it. For 2 months of the 12, when the heather is in blossom, all that Chase is a glowing reach of amaranth and purple. Then it fades away to pale orange, dim olive, and a rusty brown when Christmas shudders over it. And so throughout young green and russet, till the July tint comes back again. Oftentimes in the fresh spring morning the blackcocks, heath–poults as they call them, lift their necks in the livening heather, swell their ruffing breasts, and crow for their rivals to come and spar with them. Below the Chase the whiskers of the curling wood converge into a giant beard, tufted here and there with hues of a varying richness, but for the main of it swelling and waving, crisping, fronding, feathering, coying and darkening here and there, until it reached the silver mirror of the spreading sea. And the seaman, looking upwards from the warship bound for India, looking back at his native land, for the last of all times it may be, over brushwood waves and billows of trees, and the long heave of the gorse land. "Now that's the sort of place," he says, as the distant gables glisten, "the right sort of berth for our jolly old Admiral, and me for his butler, please God, when we've licked them Crappos as ought to be." South-west of the house, half a mile away, and scattered along the Warren, the simple village of Nowelhurst digests its own ideas. In and out the houses stand, endwise, crosswise, skewified, anyhow except upside down, and some even tending that way. It looks like a game of dominoes, when the leaves of the table have opened, and gape betwixt the players. Nevertheless, it is all good English, for none are bitterly poor there. In any case of illness, they have the great house to help them, not proudly, but with feeling. And, more than this, they have a parson who leads instead of driving them. There are two little shops exceedingly anxious to undersell each other, and one mild alehouse conducted strictly upon philosophic principles. Philosophy under pressure, a caviller would call it, for the publican knows, and so do his customers, that if poachers were encouraged there, or any uproarious doings permitted, except in the week of the old and new year, down would come his licence-board, like a flag hauled in at sunset. Pleasant folk who there do dwell, calling their existence life, and on the whole enjoying it more than any of us do, forasmuch as they know their neighbours far better than themselves, and perceive each cousin's need of trial, and console him when he gets it. Not but we ourselves partake the first and second advantages, only we miss the fruition of them by turning our backs on the sufferer. Nowelhurst village is not on the main road, but keeps a straggling companionship with the quiet parish highway, which requires much encouragement. This little highway does its best to blink the many difficulties, or, if that may not be, to compromise them, and establish a pleasant footing upon its devious wandering course from the Lymington road to Ringwood. Here it goes zig to escape the frown of a heavy–browed crest in furzery, and then it comes zag when no soul expects it, because a little stream has babbled at it. It even seems to bob, and dip, or jump, as the case may be, for fear of prying into an old oak's story, or dusting a piece of grass–land. The hard–hearted traveller who lives express, and is bound for the train at Ringwood, curses too often, up hill and down dale, the quiet lane's inconsistency. What right has any road to do anything but go straight on end to its purpose? What decent road stops for a gossip with flowers, flowers overhanging the steep ascent, or eavesdropping on the rabbit–holes? And as for the beauty of ferns, confound them, they shelter the horse–fly, that horrible forest–fly, whose tickling no civilized horse can endure. Even locusts he has heard of as abounding in the New Forest, and if a swarm of them comes this very hot weather, good–bye to him, horse and trap, newest patterns, sweet plaid, and chaste things. And good–bye to thee, thou bustling traveller, whether technically so called or otherwise, a very good fellow in thy way, but not of nature's pattern, so countersunk, so turned in a lathe, so pressed and rolled by steam–power, and then condensed hydraulically, that the extract of flowers upon thy shirt is but as the oil of machinery. But we who carry no chronometer, neither puff locomotively. Now he is round the corner. Let us saunter down this lane beyond the mark–oak and the blacksmith's, even to the sandy rise whence the Hall is seen. The rabbits are peeping forth again, for the dew is spreading quietude. The sun has just finished a good day's work, and is off for the western waters. Over the rounded heads and bosses, and then the darker dimples of the many–coloured foliage, many–coloured even now with summer's glory fusing it, over heads and shoulders and breasts of heaving green, floods the lucid amber, trembling at its own beauty, the first acknowledged leniency of the July sun. Now every moment has its difference. Having once acknowledged that he may have been too downright in his ride of triumph, the sun, like every generous nature, scatters broadcast his amends. Over holt and knoll and lea and narrow dingle, scooped with shadow where the brook is wimpling, and through the brakes of grass and gravel where the heather purples, scarcely yet in prime flush, and down the tall wood overhanging, mossed and lichened, green and grey as the grove of Druids, over, through, and under all flows pervading sunset. Then the birds begin discoursing of the thoughts within them, thoughts that are all happiness, and thrill and swell in utterance. Through the voice of the thicket–birds, the mavis, the whinchats, and the warblers, comes the tap of the yaffingale, the sharp, short cry of the honey–buzzard above the squirrel's cage, and the plaining of the turtle–dove. But from birds and flowers, winding roads, and woods, and waters where the trout are leaping, come we back to the only thing that interests a man much, the life, the doings, and the death of his fellow–men. From this piece of yellow road, where the tree–roots twist and wrestle, we can see the great old house, winking out of countless windows, deep with sloping shadows, mantling back from the clasp of the forest in a stately sad reserve. It looks like a house that can endure, and not talk about affliction, that could disclose some tales of passion were it not undignified, that remembers many a generation, and is mildly sorry for them. O house of the Knowles, grey with shadow, wrapped in lonely grandeur, cold with the dews of evening and the tone of silver nightfall, never through 20 generations hast thou known a darker fortune than is gathering now around thee, growing through the summer months, deepening ere the leaves drop. All men, we know, are born for trial, to work, to bear, to purify. But some there are whom God has marked for sorrow from their cradle, and strange as it appears to us, whose image is inverted, almost always these are they who seem to lack no probation. The gentle and the large of heart, the meek and unpretending, yet gifted with the rank of mind that needs no self–assertion, trebly vexed in this wayfaring, we doubt not they are blessed tenfold in their everlasting equipoise. Perhaps it was the July evening that made me dream and moralize. But now let us gaze from that hill again, under the fringe of autumn's gold, in the ripeness of October. The rabbits are gone to bed much earlier, comparatively I mean, with the sun's retirement, because the dew is getting cold, and so has lost its flavour. And a nest of young weasels is coming abroad, and really makes it unsafe, my dear, says Mrs. Bunny to her third family, to keep our long–standing engagements. Send cards instead, says the timid Miss Coney. I can write them, mamma, on a polypod. Now though the rabbits shirk their duty, we can see the congregation returning down the village from the church, which is over the bridge, towards Lymington, and seems set aside to meditate. In straggling groups, as gossip lumps them, or the afternoon sermon disposes, home they straggle, wondering whether the girl has kept the fire up, kept the fire blissy, as the bodily form of the house thought. But all the experienced matrons of the village have got together, and 2 who have served as monthly nurses are ready to pull side hair out. There is nothing like science for setting people hard by the ears and the throat–strings. But we who are up in the forest here can catch no buzz of voices, nor even gather the point of dispute, while they hurry on to recount their arguments, and triumph over the virile mind, which, of course, knows nothing about it. The question is, when Lady Nowell will give an heir to the name, the house, the village, the estates, worth 50,000 a year, an heir long time expected, hoped for in vain through 6 long years, now reasonably looked for. All the matrons have settled that it must be on a Sunday. Everybody knows that Sunday is the day for all grand ceremonies. Even Nanny Gammon's pigs, But why pursue their arguments? The taste of the present age is so wonderfully nice and delicate. I can only say that the Gammers, who snubbed the Gaffers upon the subject, miscarried by a fortnight, though right enough hebdomadally. They all fixed it for that day fortnight, but it was done while they were predicting, and not even the monthly nurses anticipated, no one ever guessed of the contingency of twins. End of Cradock Nowell, A Tale of the New Forest, Volume 1, Chapter 1.
Emily Fox-Seton, Chapter 1, by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eleanor Howard, Greencastle, Indiana. Chapter 1. When Miss Fox-Seton descended from the Tupney bus as it drew up, she gathered her trim tailor-made skirt about her with neatness and decorum, being well used to getting in and out of Tupney buses, and to making her way across muddy London streets. A woman whose tailor-made suit must last 2 or 3 years soon learns how to protect it from splashes, and how to aid it to retain the freshness of its folds. During her trudging about this morning in the wet, Emily Fox-Seton had been very careful, and in fact was returning to Mortimer Street as unspotted as she had left it. She had been thinking a good deal about her dress, this particular faithful one which she had already worn through a 12-month. Skirts had made one of their appalling changes, and as she walked down Regent Street and Bond Street, she had stopped at the windows of more than one shop bearing the sign, Ladies' Tailor and Habit Maker, and had looked at the tautly attired, preternaturally slim models, her large, honest, hazel eyes wearing an anxious expression. She was trying to discover where seams were to be placed, and how gathers were to be hung, or if there were to be gathers at all, or if one had to be bereft of every seam in a style so unrelenting as to forbid the possibility of the honest and semi-penniless struggling with the problem of remodelling last season's skirt at all. "As it is only quite an ordinary brown," she had murmured to herself, "I might be able to buy a yard or so to match it, and I might be able to join the gore near the pleats at the back, so that it would not be seen." She quite beamed as she reached the happy conclusion. She was such a simple, normal-minded creature that it took but little to brighten the aspect of life for her, and to cause her to break into her good-natured, childlike smile. A little kindness from anyone, a little pleasure or a little comfort, made her glow with nice-tempered enjoyment. As she got out of the bus and picked up her rough brown skirt, prepared to tramp bravely through the mud of Mortimer Street to her lodgings, she was positively radiant. It was not only her smile which was childlike, her face itself was childlike for a woman of her age and size. She was 34 and a well-set-up creature, with fine square shoulders and a long small waist and good hips. She was a big woman, but carried herself well, and having solved the problem of obtaining, through marvels of energy and management, one good dress a year, wore it so well, and changed her old one so dexterously, that she always looked rather smartly dressed. She had nice round fresh cheeks, and nice big honest eyes, plenty of mouse-brown hair, and a short straight nose. She was striking and well-bred looking, and her plenitude of good-natured interest in everybody, and her pleasure in everything out of which pleasure could be wrested, gave her big eyes a fresh look which made her seem rather like a nice overgrown girl than a mature woman whose life was a continuous struggle with the narrowest of mean fortunes. She was a woman of good blood and of good education, as the education of such women goes. She had few relatives, and none of them had any intention of burdening themselves with her pennilessness. They were people of excellent family, but had quite enough to do to keep their sons in the army, or navy, and find husbands for their daughters. When Emily's mother had died, and her small annuity had died with her, none of them had wanted the care of a big raw-boned girl, and Emily had had the situation frankly explained to her. At 18 she had begun to work as assistant teacher in a small school. The year following she had taken a place as nursery governess. Then she had been a reading companion to an unpleasant old woman in Northumberland. The old woman had lived in the country, and her relatives had hovered over her like vultures awaiting her decease. The household had been gloomy and gruesome enough to have driven into melancholy madness any girl not of the sanest and most matter-of-fact temperament. Emily Fox-Seton had endured it with an unfailing good nature, which at last had actually awakened in the breast of her mistress a ray of human feeling. When the old woman at length died, and Emily was to be turned out into the world, it was revealed that she had been left a legacy of a few £100, and a letter containing some rather practical, if harshly expressed, advice. "Go back to London," Mrs. Maytham had written in her feeble, crabbed hand. "You are not clever enough to do anything remarkable in the way of earning your living, but you are so good-natured that you can make yourself useful to a lot of helpless creatures who will pay you a trifle for looking after them and the affairs they are too lazy or too foolish to manage for themselves. You might get on to one of the second-class fashion papers to answer ridiculous questions about housekeeping or wallpaper or freckles. You know the kind of thing I mean. You might write notes or do accounts and shopping for some lazy woman. You are a practical, honest creature, and you have good manners. I have often thought that you had just the kind of commonplace gifts that a host of commonplace people want to find at their service. An old servant of mine who lives in Mortimer Street would probably give you cheap, decent lodgings, and behave well to you, for my sake. She has reason to be fond of me. Tell her I sent you to her, and that she must take you in for 10 shillings a week." Emily wept for gratitude, and ever afterward enthroned old Mrs. Maytham on an altar as a princely and sainted benefactor, though after she had invested her legacy she only got £20 a year from it. "It was so kind of her," she used to say with heartfelt humbleness of spirit. "I never dreamed of her doing such a generous thing. I hadn't a shadow of a claim upon her, not a shadow." It was her way to express her honest emotions with emphasis which italicized, as it were, her outpourings of pleasure or appreciation. She returned to London, and presented herself to the ex-serving woman. Mrs. Cupp had indeed reason to remember her mistress gratefully. At a time when youth and indiscreet affection had betrayed her disastrously, she had been saved from open disgrace and taken care of by Mrs. Maytham. The old lady, who had then been a vigorous, sharp-tongued, middle-aged woman, had made the soldier-lover marry his despairing sweetheart, and when he had promptly drunk himself to death, she had set her up in a lodging-house which had thriven and enabled her to support herself and her daughter decently. In the second story of her respectable, dingy house there was a small room, which she went to some trouble to furnish up for her dead mistress's friend. It was made into a bed-sitting-room with the aid of a cot, which Emily herself bought and disguised decently as a couch during the daytime, by means of a red and blue Como blanket. The one window of the room looked out upon a black little backyard and a sooty wall on which thin cats crept stealthily or sat and mournfully gazed at fate. The Como rug played a large part in the decoration of the apartment. One of them, with a piece of tape run through a hem, hung over the door in the character of a portière. Another covered a corner which was Miss Fox-Seton's sole wardrobe. As she began to get work, the cheerful, aspiring creature bought herself a Kensington carpet-square, as red as Kensington art would permit it to be. She covered her chairs with turkey-red cotton, frilling them around the seats. Over her cheap white muslin curtains, 8 and 11 a pair at Robson's, she hung turkey-red draperies. She bought a cheap cushion at one of Liberty's sales, and some bits of twopenny-halfpenny art china for her narrow mantelpiece. A lacquered tea-tray and a tea-set of a single cup and saucer, a plate and a teapot, made her feel herself almost sumptuous. After a day spent in trudging about in the wet or cold of the streets, doing other people's shopping, or searching for dressmakers, or servants' characters for her patrons, she used to think of her bed-sitting-room with joyful anticipation. Mrs. Cupp always had a bright fire glowing in her tiny grate when she came in, and when her lamp was lighted under its home-made shade of crimson Japanese paper, its cheerful air, combining itself with the singing of her little fat black kettle on the hob, seemed absolute luxury to a tired, damp woman. Mrs. Cupp and Jane Cupp were very kind and attentive to her. No one who lived in the same house with her could have helped liking her. She gave so little trouble, and was so expansively pleased by any attention, that the Cupps, who were sometimes rather bullied and snubbed by the professionals who generally occupied their other rooms, quite loved her. Sometimes the professionals, extremely smart ladies and gentlemen who did turns at the balls or played small parts at theatres, were irregular in their payments, or went away leaving bills behind them, but Miss Fox-Seton's payments were as regular as Saturday night, and in fact there had been times when, luck being against her, Emily had gone extremely hungry during a whole week, rather than buy her lunches at the ladies' tea-shops with the money that would pay her rent. In the honest minds of the Cupps she had become a sort of possession of which they were proud. She seemed to bring into their dingy lodging-house a touch of the great world, that world whose people lived in Mayfair, and had country houses where they entertained parties for the shooting and the hunting, and in which also existed the maids and matrons who on cold spring mornings sat, amid billows of satin and tulle and lace, surrounded with nodding plumes, waiting, shivering, for hours in their carriages, that they might at last enter Buckingham Palace and be admitted to the drawing-room. Mrs. Cupp knew that Miss Fox-Seton was well connected. She knew that she possessed an aunt with a title, though her ladyship never took the slightest notice of her niece. Jane Cupp took modern society, and now and then had the pleasure of reading aloud to her young man little incidents concerning some castle or manor in which Miss Fox-Seton's aunt, Lady Malfrey, was staying, with earls and special favourites of the princes. Jane also knew that Miss Fox-Seton occasionally sent letters addressed to the Right Honourable the Countess of So-and-so, and received replies stamped with coronets. Once even a letter had arrived adorned with strawberry leaves, an incident which Mrs. Cupp and Jane had discussed with deep interest over their hot buttered toast and tea. Emily Fox-Seton, however, was far from making any professions of grandeur. As time went on, she had become fond enough of the Cupps to be quite frank with them about her connections with these grand people. The Countess had heard from a friend that Miss Fox-Seton had once found her an excellent governess, and she had commissioned her to find for her a reliable young lady's serving-maid. She had done some secretarial work for a charity of which the Duchess was patroness. In fact, these people knew her only as a well-bred woman who, for a modest remuneration, would make herself extremely useful in numberless practical ways. She knew much more of them than they knew of her, and in her affectionate admiration for those who treated her with human kindness, sometimes spoke to Mrs. Cupp or Jane of their beauty or charity with a very nice ingenuous feeling. Naturally, some of her patrons grew fond of her, and as she was a fine, handsome young woman, with a perfectly correct bearing, they gave her little pleasures, inviting her to tea or luncheon, or taking her to the theatre. Her enjoyment of these things was so frank and grateful that the Cupps counted them among their own joys. Jane Cupp, who knew something of dressmaking, felt it a brilliant thing to be called upon to renovate an old dress or help in the making of a new one for some festivity. The Cupps thought their tall, well-built lodger something of a beauty, and when they had helped her to dress for the evening, baring her fine, big, white neck and arms, and adorning her thick braids of hair with some sparkling, trembling ornaments, after putting her in her four-wheeled cab, they used to go back to their kitchen and talk about her, and wonder that some gentleman who wanted a handsome, stylish woman at the head of his table did not lay himself and his fortune at her feet. In the photograph shops in Regent Street you see many a lady in a coronet that hasn't half the good looks she has, Mrs. Cupp remarked frequently. She's got a nice complexion and a fine head of hair, and if you ask me, she's got as nice a pair of clear eyes as a lady could have. Then look at her figure, her neck, and her waist. That kind of big long throat of hers would set off rows of pearls or diamonds beautiful. She's a lady born to, for all her simple everyday way. And she's a sweet creature, if ever there was one. For kind-heartedness and good nature, I never saw her equal. Miss Fox-Seton had middle-class patrons as well as noble ones. In fact, those of the middle class were far more numerous than the Duchesses, so it had been possible for her to do more than one good turn for the Cupp household. She had got sewing in Maida Vale and Bloomsbury for Jane Cupp many a time, and Mrs. Cupp's dining-room floor had been occupied for years by a young man Emily had been able to recommend. Her own appreciation of good turns made her eager to do them for others. She never let slip a chance to help anyone in any way. It was a good-natured thing done by one of her patrons who liked her, which made her so radiant as she walked through the mud this morning. She was inordinately fond of the country, and having had what she called a bad winter, she had not seen the remotest chance of getting out of town at all during the summer months. The weather was beginning to be unusually hot, and her small red room, which seemed so cosy in winter, was shut in by a high wall from all chance of breezes. Occasionally she lay and panted a little in her cot, and felt that when all the private omnibuses loaded with trunks and servants had rattled away and deposited their burdens at the various stations, life in town would be rather lonely. Everyone she knew would have gone somewhere, and Mortimer Street in August was a melancholy thing. And Lady Maria had actually invited her to Mallow! What a piece of good fortune! What an extraordinary piece of kindness! She did not know what a source of entertainment she was to Lady Maria, and how the shrewd, worldly old thing liked her. Lady Maria Bayne was the cleverest, sharpest-tongued, smartest old woman in London. She knew everybody and had done everything in her youth, a good many things not considered highly proper. A certain royal duke had been much pleased with her, and people had said some very nasty things about it. But this had not hurt Lady Maria. She knew how to say nasty things herself, and as she said them wittily, they were usually listened to and repeated. Emily Fox-Seton had gone to her first to write notes for an hour every evening. She had sent, declined, and accepted invitations, and put off charities and dull people. She wrote a fine dashing hand, and had a matter-of-fact intelligence and knowledge of things. Lady Maria began to depend on her, and to find that she could be sent on errands and depended on to do a number of things. Consequently, she was often at South Audley Street, and once, when Lady Maria was suddenly taken ill and was horribly frightened about herself, Emily was such a comfort to her that she kept her for 3 weeks. "The creature is so cheerful and perfectly free from vice that she's a relief," her ladyship said to her nephew afterward. "So many women are affected cats. She'll go out and buy you a box of pills or a porous plaster, but at the same time she has a kind of simplicity and freedom from spites and envies, which might be the natural thing for a princess." So it happened that occasionally Emily put on her best dress and most carefully built hat, and went to South Audley Street to tea. Sometimes she had previously gone in buses to some remote place in the city to buy a specialty of which there had been rumours. She met some very smart people, and rarely any stupid ones, Lady Maria being encased in a perfect frank armour of good-humoured selfishness, which would have been capable of burning dulness at the stake. "I won't have dull people," she used to say. "I'm dull myself." When Emily Fox-Seton went to her on the morning in which this story opens, she found her consulting her visiting book and making lists. "I'm arranging my parties for Mallow," she said rather crossly. "How tiresome it is! The people one wants at the same time are always nailed to opposite ends of the earth, and then things are found out about people, and one can't have them till it's blown over. Those ridiculous Dexters! They were the nicest possible pair, both of them good-looking, and both of them ready to flirt with anybody. But there was too much flirting, I suppose. Good heavens! If I couldn't have a scandal and keep it quiet, I wouldn't have a scandal at all. Come and help me, Emily." Emily sat down beside her. "You see, it is my early August party," said her ladyship, rubbing her delicate little old nose with her pencil, "and Walderhurst is coming to me. It always amuses me to have Walderhurst. The moment a man like that comes into a room, the women begin to frisk about and swim and languish, except those who try to get up interesting conversations they think likely to attract his attention. They all think it is possible that he may marry them. If he were a Mormon, he might have Marchionesses of Walderhurst of all shapes and sizes." "I suppose," said Emily, "that he was very much in love with his first wife, and will never marry again." "He wasn't in love with her any more than he was in love with his housemaid. He knew he must marry, and thought it very annoying. As the child died, I believe he thinks it his duty to marry again, but he hates it. He's rather dull, and he can't bear women fussing about and wanting to be made love to." They went over the visiting book and discussed people and dates seriously. The list was made and the notes written before Emily left the house. It was not until she had got up and was buttoning her coat that Lady Maria bestowed her boon. "Emily," she said, "I am going to ask you to Mallow on the 2nd. I want you to help me to take care of people, and keep them from boring me and one another, though I don't mind their boring one another half so much as I mind their boring me. I want to be able to go off and take my nap at any hour I choose. I will not entertain people. What you can do is lead them off to gather things or look at church towers. I hope you'll come." Emily Fox-Seton's face flushed rosily, and her eyes opened and sparkled. "Oh, Lady Maria, you are kind," she said. "You know how I should enjoy it. I have heard so much of Mallow. Everyone says it is so beautiful, and that there are no such gardens in England." "They are good gardens. My husband was rather mad about roses. The best train for you to take is the 2:30 from Paddington. That will bring you to the court just in time for tea on the lawn." Emily could have kissed Lady Maria if they had been on the terms which lead people to make demonstrations of affection, but she would have been quite as likely to kiss the butler when he bent over her at dinner and murmured in dignified confidence, "Port or sherry, miss?" Bibsworth would have been no more astonished than Lady Maria would, and Bibsworth certainly would have expired of disgust and horror. She was so happy when she hailed the Tupney bus that when she got into it her face was beaming with the delight which adds freshness and good looks to any woman. To think that such good luck had come to her, to think of leaving her hot little room behind her and going as a guest to one of the most beautiful old houses in England! How delightful it would be to live for a while quite naturally the life the fortunate people lived year after year, to be a part of the beautiful order and picturesqueness and dignity of it, to sleep in a lovely bedroom, to be called in the morning by a perfect housemaid, to have one's early tea served in a delicate cup, and to listen, as one drank it, to the birds singing in the trees in the park. She had an ingenuous appreciation of the simplest material joys, and the fact that she would wear her nicest clothes every day, and dress for dinner every evening, was a delightful thing to reflect upon. She got so much more out of life than most people, though she was not aware of it. She opened the front door of the house in Mortimer Street with her latchkey, and went upstairs almost unconscious that the damp heat was dreadful. She met Jane Cupp coming down, and smiled at her happily. "Jane," she said, "if you are not busy, I should like to have a little talk with you. Will you come into my room?" "Yes, miss," Jane replied, with her usual respectful lady's-maid air. It was, in truth, Jane's highest ambition to become some day maid to a great lady, and she privately felt that her association with Miss Fox-Seton was the best possible training. She used to ask to be allowed to dress her when she went out, and had felt it a privilege to be permitted to do her hair. She helped Emily to remove her walking dress, and neatly folded away her gloves and veil. She knelt down before her as soon as she saw her seat herself to take off her muddy boots. "Oh, thank you, Jane," Emily exclaimed, with her kind italicized manner. "That is good of you. I am tired, really, but such a nice thing has happened. I have had such a delightful invitation for the first week in August." "I'm sure you'll enjoy it, miss," said Jane. "It's so hot in August." "Lady Maria Bain has been kind enough to invite me to Mallow Court," explained Emily, smiling down at the cheap slipper Jane was putting on her large, well-shaped foot. She was built on a large scale, and her foot was of no Cinderella-like proportions. "Oh, miss," exclaimed Jane, "how beautiful! I was reading about Mallow in Modern Society the other day, and it said it was lovely, and her ladyship's parties were wonderful for smartness. The paragraph was about the Marquis of Walderhurst." "He is Lady Maria's cousin," said Emily, "and he will be there when I am." She was a friendly creature, and lived a life so really isolated from any ordinary companionship that her simple little talks with Jane and Mrs. Cupp were a pleasure to her. The Cupps were neither gossiping nor intrusive, and she felt as if they were her friends. Once, when she had been ill for a week, She remembered suddenly realizing that she had no intimates at all, and that if she died Mrs. Cupp's and Jane's would certainly be the last faces, and the only ones, she would see. She had cried a little the night she thought of it, but then, as she told herself, she was feverish and weak, and it made her morbid. "It was because of this invitation that I wanted to talk to you, Jane," she went on. "You see, we shall have to begin to contrive about dresses." "Yes, indeed, miss. It's fortunate that the summer sales are on, isn't it? I saw some beautiful coloured linens yesterday. They were so cheap, and they do make up so smart for the country. Then you've got your new Tesoro with a blue collar and waistband. It does become you." "I must say I think that a Tesoro always looks fresh," said Emily, "and I saw a really nice little tan toque, one of those soft straw ones, for 3 and 11, and just a twist of blue chiffon and a wing would make it look quite good." She was very clever with her fingers, and often did excellent things with a bit of chiffon and a wing, or a few yards of linen or muslin and a remnant of lace picked up at a sale. She and Jane spent quite a happy afternoon in careful united contemplation of the resources of her limited wardrobe. They found that the brown skirt could be altered, and with the addition of new revers and collar and a jabot of string-coloured lace at the neck, would look quite fresh. A black net evening dress, which a patron had good-naturedly given her the year before, could be remodelled and touched up delightfully. Her fresh face and her square white shoulders were particularly adorned by black. There was a white dress which could be sent to the cleaners, and an old pink one whose superfluous breadths could be combined with lace and achieve wonders. "Indeed, I think I shall be very well off for dinner dresses," said Emily. "Nobody expects me to change often. Every one knows, if they notice at all." She did not know she was humble-minded and of an angelic contentedness of spirit. In fact, she did not find herself interested in contemplation of her own qualities, but in contemplation and admiration of those of other people. It was necessary to provide Emily Fox-Seton with food and lodging, and such a wardrobe as would be just sufficient credit to her more fortunate acquaintances. She worked hard to attain this modest end, and was quite satisfied. She found at the shops, where the summer sales were being held, a couple of cotton frocks to which her height and her small long waist gave an air of actual elegance, a sailor hat with a smart ribbon and well-set quill, a few new trifles for her neck, a bow, a silk handkerchief daringly knotted, and some fresh gloves, made her feel that she was sufficiently equipped. During her last expedition to the sales she came upon a nice white duck coat and skirt, which she contrived to buy as a present for Jane. It was necessary to count over the contents of her purse very carefully, and to give up the purchase of a slim umbrella she wanted, but she did it cheerfully. If she had been a rich woman she would have given presents to every one she knew, and it was actually a luxury to her to be able to do something for the Cupps, who, she always felt, were continually giving her more than she paid for. The care they took of her small room, the fresh hot tea they managed to have ready when she came in, the penny bunch of daffodils they sometimes put on her table, were kindnesses, and she was grateful for them. "I'm very much obliged to you, Jane," she said to the girl, when she got into the four-wheeled cab on the eventful day of her journey to Mallow. "I don't know what I should have done without you, I'm sure. I feel so smart in my dress now that you have altered it. If Lady Maria's maid ever thinks of leaving her, I am sure I could recommend you for her place." End of Emily Fox-Seton, Chapter 1, by Frances Hodgson Burnett.
Haiti, its dawn of progress after years in a night of revolution. Chapter 1, Sargasso and Flying Fish, by J. Dryden Cuser. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. For the first 2 days out of New York Harbor, flocks of herring gulls followed us, and occasionally an odd robin, and a pair of goldfinches appeared. But after Hatteras we paused and the sea was calmer, the gulls left us, and flying fish took their place. Stationed at the bow I watched them dart out of the foam and skim, sometimes a few feet, often many yards. At night I took the same post, and the phosphorescent stars of the sea shone very green against the yellow constellations above. By the third day, ever-increasing quantities of sargasso weed appeared and floated past. Torn from beds along tropical coasts, these bits of weed act as the shelter for multifarious forms of aquatic life which live as long as the weed lives and die when it finally decays. And so, although no sign of bird or other life appeared above the water's surface, we were surrounded every moment by thousands of individuals of dozens of species. Our ship was the Advance of the American government-controlled Panama R.R. Steamship Company, which operates the service between New York, Haiti, and Panama. 2 steamers run to Panama via Port-au-Prince, Haiti. 3 are exclusively for Haitian ports, while the others do not stop at Haiti en route to Panama. Besides the Panama line, there is the Dutch line of boats, which runs from New York to Haiti on regular sailings. But aside from these 2, there are no other lines which regularly run ships to Haiti. And so the quickest way of traveling from Haiti to another of the West Indies is via Panama. Coming south, the first land appeared on the 4th day, when the lighthouse of San Salvador, renamed Watling's Island by the British, showed the northern point of land long before the rest of the flat surface was visible. Bird Rock, the Fortune Islands, and Castle Island were passed during the next 12 hours. And finally the high mountains of eastern Cuba were 20 miles off our starboard. Before these were out of sight, the peak of Mole St. Nicholas, Haiti, arose on the port bow, but we were by no means yet at Port-au-Prince, our destination, for it is a 7-hour sail from this point to the harbor in the lower part of the bay. The bay itself is over 100 miles long, and in the center of it is the island of Gonave, 10 by 40 miles, to which all convicts were exiled from Haiti in the French days, and many of whose present inhabitants are descendants of these exiles. After we had passed Gonave, the mountain ranges on both sides became very close, and we could see the smoke of many fires high up on their slopes. These fires, we later found out, were those of the charcoal burners, who play an important role on the island. The charcoal is obtained by placing the wood, which has been gathered, under a covering of earth in such a way as to eliminate the undesired gases and leave the charcoal. After sufficient time the earth is removed, and the charcoal carried for miles into town on the backs of burros. Charcoal is used entirely in Haiti for kitchen fuel. Of the fires we saw in the hills, all were probably not those of charcoal burners, as it is the common thing for the natives to burn off a section of land which they desire to use, and to ascribe the fire to spontaneous combustion. At last the vari-colored lights of Port-au-Prince peeped forth from among the foothills on the right, and we followed the channel in by alignment with 2 large red range lights, one on the top of the cathedral and the other on Fort National. The beauty of coming into Port-au-Prince is by daylight, when, not unlike Sorrento, it shows a background of 2,800-foot mountains rising behind, and with a pellucid green sea stretching out from the town. A Haytian launch came alongside for the custom officials to board. Our passports were taken to be kept for overnight and recorded, and we were then allowed to proceed to the dock, which is at the end of a long pier jutting out from the land. As we spun along to the house where we were to visit, we went over streets smoother and wider than all but a few in the United States. These streets, throughout most of the town, were put down under contract with an American firm in 1914, before American occupation of Haiti, and are of excellent quality. From the business district we came into the Champ de Mars, a laid-out park with a bronze of Dessalines, the founder of Haitian independence, in the center, and at the end a grandstand from which to watch the sports or national festivities. Next to the Champ de Mars is the new palace of the President of Haiti. It is now at a stage of near completion, and one wing is already occupied by the President and his family. This building is the 4th palace to be built on the same site, one of the others having been set on fire and destroyed, and the other 2 ruined through explosions. In the latter cases the President had been unable to trust anyone with the keeping of the national supply of ammunition, and was forced to keep it in his own palace, so that in both cases the Presidents were killed by means of their own powder. On the lower side of the palace are the Marine Barracks and the Gendarme Caserne. Opposite one another, and above the Champ de Mars, is the Marine Brigade headquarters. At this point starts the residential section of the town for both wealthy Haitians and Americans and other foreigners. We rode over narrow, quaint streets after passing the Marine headquarters until we came to Avenue Christophe and our house, of old French style, and with peaked roof, which was at one time used as the presidential palace. Most of the houses of Port-au-Prince are of this old French style, and show few traces of the original Spanish. Around all the better houses are dense tropical growths, with mangoes, oranges, and guanabana, or sour sap, hanging over the porches. Many of the yards have also one or two royal palms, with their great white trunks reaching over 50 feet, and with leaves clustered at the top. At the very tip of the tree's trunk is the heart, for which many trees are cut down, as heart of palm is one of the delicacies of the tropics. In the country districts both the royal and cocoanut palm are common. The two are somewhat similar, but can be easily told apart by the crooked growth of the latter and also its darker and rougher trunk. The first morning after our arrival was cloudy, which was very unusual, for throughout the year in Port-au-Prince the mornings are almost invariably clear. So is the remainder of the day for the 6 months during the dry season, but in the wet season it regularly rains a downpour for about 2 hours late each afternoon. November is the beginning of the dry season, so for a couple of weeks after our arrival it would still occasionally rain for a few moments a day. But we missed having any of the truly tropical rains which during the summer flood the streets and sweep all before them. While the winter is for Port-au-Prince and southern Haiti the dry season, the conditions are exactly reversed in the northern half of the Republic. There the wet season commences in November to last for 6 months until next summer, when all becomes dry again. And so there is never a time in Haiti when half of the island is not being well watered and the fruit and crops in season. End of Haiti, its Dawn of Progress after Years and a Night of Revolution. Chapter 1, Sargasso and Flying Fish, by J. Dryden Couser.
The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Chapter 1, by Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eleanor Howard, Greencastle, Indiana. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth, mainly. There were things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. That is nothin'. I never seen anybody but lied one time or another, without it was Aunt Polly, or the widow, or maybe Mary. Aunt Polly, Tom's Aunt Polly, she is, and Mary, and the widow Douglas, is all told about in that book, which is mostly a true book, with some stretchers, as I said before. Now the way that book winds up is this. Tom and me found the money that the robbers hid in the cave, and it made us rich. We got $6,000 apiece, all gold. It was an awful sight of money when it was piled up. Well, Judge Thatcher, he took it and put it out at interest, and it fetched us $1 a day apiece all the year round, more than a body could tell what to do with. The widow Douglas, she took me for her son, and allowed she would civilize me, but it was rough living in the house all the time, considerin' how dismal regular and decent the widow was in all her ways, and so when I couldn't stand it no longer, I lit out. I got into my old rags and my sugar hogshead again, and was free and satisfied. But Tom Sawyer, he hunted me up, said he was going to start a band of robbers, and I might join if I would go back to the widow and be respectable. So I went back. The widow, she cried over me and called me a poor lost lamb, and she called me a lot of other names too, but she never meant no harm by it. She put me in them new clothes again, and I couldn't do nothing but sweat and feel all cramped up. Well then, the old thing commenced again. The widow rung a bell for supper, and you had to come to time. When you got to the table, you couldn't go right to eatin', but you had to wait for the widow to tuck down her head and grumble a little over the victuals, though there warn't really anything the matter with 'em. That is, nothing, only everything was cooked by itself. In a barrel of odds and ends it is different. Things get mixed up, and the juice kind of swaps around, and the things go better. After supper she got out her book and learned me about Moses and the bulrushers, and I was in a sweat to find out all about him. But by and by she let out that Moses had been dead a considerable long time, so then I didn't care no more about him, because I don't take no stock in dead people. Pretty soon I wanted to smoke, and asked the widow to let me, but she wouldn't. She said it was a mean practice and wasn't clean, and I must try not to do it any more. That is just the way with some people. They get down on a thing when they don't know nothing about it. Here she was a-botherin' about Moses, which was no kin to her and no use to anybody, bein' gone, you see, yet finding a power of fault with me for doing a thing that had some good in it. And she took snuff, too. Of course that was all right, because she done it herself. Her sister, Miss Watson, a tolerable slim old maid with goggles on, had just come to live with her, and took a set at me now with a spellin' book. She worked me middlin' hard for about an hour, and then the widow made her ease up. I couldn't have stood it much longer. Then for an hour it was deadly dull, and I was fidgety. Miss Watson would say, "Don't put your feet up there, Huckleberry," and "Don't scrunch up like that, Huckleberry, sit up straight," and pretty soon she would say, "Don't gap and stretch like that, Huckleberry, why don't you try to behave?" Then she told me all about the bad place, and I said I wished I was there. She got mad then, but I didn't mean no harm. All I wanted was to go somewheres. All I wanted was a change. I weren't particular. She said it was wicked to say what I said she wouldn't say it for the whole world. She was going to live so as to go to the good place. Well, I couldn't see no advantage in going where she was going, so I made up my mind I wouldn't try for it. But I never said so, because it would only make trouble and wouldn't do no good. Now she had got a start, and she went on and told me all about the good place. She said all a body would have to do there was to go around all day long with a harp and sing, for ever and ever. So I didn't think much of it. But I never said so. I asked her if she reckoned Tom Sawyer would go there, and she said not by a considerable sight. I was glad about that, because I wanted him and me to be together. Miss Watson, she kept pecking at me, and it got tiresome and lonesome. By and by they fetched the niggers in and had prayers, and then everybody was off to bed. I went up to my room with a piece of candle and put it on the table. Then I sat down in a chair by the window and tried to think of something cheerful, but it warn't no use. I felt so lonesome I most wish I was dead. The stars were shining, and the leaves rustled in the woods ever so mournful, and I heard an owl away off, hoo-hooing about somebody that was dead, and a whippoorwill and a dog crying about somebody that was a-going to die. And the wind was trying to whisper something to me, and I couldn't make out what it was, and so it made the cold shivers run over me. Then away out in the woods I heard that kind of sound that a ghost makes when it wants to tell about something that's on its mind, and can't make itself understood, and so can't rest easy in its grave, and has to go about that way every night grieving. I got so downhearted and scared I did wish I had some company. Pretty soon a spider went crawling up my shoulder, and I flipped it off, and it lit in the candle, and before I could budge it was all shriveled up. I didn't need anybody to tell me that that was an awful bad sign, and would fetch me some bad luck, so I was scared and most shook the clothes off of me. I got up and turned round in my tracks 3 times, and crossed my breast every time, and then I tied up a little lock of my hair with a thread to keep witches away. But I hadn't no confidence. You do that when you've lost a horseshoe that you've found, instead of nailing it up over the door, but I hadn't ever heard anybody say it was any way to keep off bad luck when you'd killed a spider. I sat down again, a-shaking all over, and got out my pipe for a smoke, for the house was all as still as death now, and so the widow wouldn't know. Well, after a long time I heard the clock away off in the town go boom, 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 12 licks, and all still again, stiller than ever. Pretty soon I heard a twig snap down in the dark amongst the trees. Something was a-stirrin'. I sat still and listened. Directly I could just barely hear a meow, meow down there. That was good. Says I, meow, meow, as soft as I could, and then I put out the light, and scrambled out of the window onto the shed. Then I slipped down to the ground and crawled in among the trees, and sure enough, there was Tom Sawyer waiting for me. End of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Chapter 1, by Mark Twain.
La Letra Escarlata, capítulo 1. La puerta de la prisión, por Nathaniel Hawthorne. Versión castellana de Francisco Sellén. Esta es una grabación para Librivox. Todas las grabaciones de Librivox están en el dominio público. Para más información o para ser voluntario, por favor visite librivox.org. Grabado por Claudia Barrett. Una multitud de hombres barbudos, vestidos con trajes obscuros y sombreros de copa alta, casi puntiaguda, de color gris, mezclados con mujeres unas con caperuzas y otras con la cabeza descubierta, se hallaba congregada frente a un edificio de madera, cuya pesada puerta de roble estaba tachonada con puntas de hierro. Los fundadores de una nueva colonia, cualesquiera que hayan sido los ensueños utópicos de virtud y felicidad que presidieran a su proyecto, han considerado siempre, entre las cosas más necesarias, dedicar a un cementerio una parte del terreno virgen y otra parte a la erección de una cárcel. De acuerdo con este principio, puede darse por sentado que los fundadores de Boston edificaron la primera cárcel en las cercanías de Cornhill, así como trazaron el primer cementerio en el lugar que después llegó a ser el núcleo de todos los sepulcros aglomerados en el antiguo camposanto de la Capilla del Rey. Es lo cierto que 15 o 20 años después de fundada la población, ya la cárcel, que era de madera, presentaba todas las señales exteriores de haber pasado algunos inviernos por ella, lo que le daba un aspecto más sombrío que el que de suyo tenía. El orín de que estaba cubierta la pesada obra de hierro de su puerta la dotaba de una apariencia de mayor antigüedad que la de ninguna otra cosa en el Nuevo Mundo. Como todo lo que se relacionaba de un modo u otro con el crimen, parecía no haber gozado nunca de juventud. Frente a este feo edificio, y entre él y los carriles o rodadas de la calle, había una especie de pradillo, en que crecían en abundancia la bardana y otras malas hierbas por el estilo, que evidentemente encontraron terreno apropiado en un sitio que ya había producido la negra flor común a una sociedad civilizada, la cárcel. Pero a un lado de la puerta, casi en el umbral, se veía un rosal silvestre que en este mes de junio estaba cubierto con las delicadas flores que pudiera decirse ofrecían su fragancia y frágil belleza a los reos que entraban en la prisión, y a los criminales condenados que salían a sufrir su pena, como si la naturaleza se compadeciera de ellos. La existencia de este rosal, por una extraña casualidad, se ha conservado en la historia, pero no trataremos de averiguar si fue simplemente un arbusto que quedó de la antigua selva primitiva después que desaparecieron los gigantescos pinos y robles que le prestaron sombra, o si, como cuenta la tradición, brotó bajo las pisadas de la santa Anna Hutchinson cuando entró en la cárcel. Sea de ello lo que fuere, puesto que lo encontramos en el umbral de nuestra narración, por decirlo así, no podemos menos que arrancar una de sus flores y ofrecérsela al lector, esperando que simbolice alguna apacible lección de moral, ya se desprenda de estas páginas, o ya sirva para mitigar el sombrío desenlace de una historia de fragilidad humana y de dolor. Fin de La Letra Escarlata, capítulo 1, por Nathaniel Hawthorne, traducida por Francisco Sellén.
Love Enthroned, Chapter 1, Love Revealed, by Daniel Steele. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. What a mystery is love! We cannot define it. We can only indicate it by describing the occasion on which it arises in the soul. If human love is inexplicable, divine love is an ocean too deep for the plummet of man or archangel, too broad to be bounded by the thought of the loftiest intelligence in the universe. He who knows not in his inmost consciousness the love of God will find this book sealed to his understanding. It can only be unlocked by the key of experience. Love is not a product of the reason. It is the free play of the spiritual sensibilities in the possession of its object. God is not only love, but He is love revealed. The perfect love of God toward man is designed to call forth perfect love toward God in man's bosom. Though the mirror on which that love is reflected is broken into uneven planes and reflects a distorted image, though the human soul at its best earthly estate under grace is shattered by infirmities and incurable imperfections, yet the love which man cherishes toward God may flow from all the united force of his being. The history of God's intercourse with men is the chronicle of His love. This is the only history which will outlive time itself, and escape the conflagration which will burn up the world and all the works therein. This will be our textbook forever. We can contemplate no more sublime and ennobling theme. The brightness of the material universe pales before the splendors of the divine character. That central fire which kindles the souls of seraphs in heaven and melts the hearts of sinners on earth. Thus is the science of the divine heart infinitely above the science of the almighty hand. In love revealed there are ceaseless wonders. Our surprise is ever new when we discover that God so loves our entire race that He gave His well-beloved Son to the humiliation of the manger, the mockery of Golgotha, the agonies of Gethsemane, and the ignominy of Calvary. But this was not the beginning of His beneficence. Since the Son of God has gone up to be glorified and worshipped by all the celestial orders, the loving Father has bestowed an abiding gift, the Holy Spirit, to whisper in the ear of spiritual death the words of life, to pardon penitents, and fully restore the lost image of God. The greatest marvels of the gospel scheme are not in the facts of Christ's earthly life, death, and resurrection, but in the wondrous transformation wrought by the Holy Spirit in the soul of the believer, who apprehends the exceeding greatness of His power to usward who believe. A less surprise is the fact that the eternal Logos should inseparably unite Himself with a spotless human body and soul than by the Holy Spirit, co-equal with the Father and the Son, should first completely cleanse a polluted man, and then change his heart from a cage of unclean birds into a holy temple, and make it the habitation of God. This is a mystery of mysteries with all who have experienced the love of God perfectly shed abroad in their hearts. The age of miracles is not past. Jesus changed unresisting water into wine, but the Holy Ghost transfigures the sinful soul bristling with antagonisms, transforming depravity to putty by the mighty alchemy of love. The power to effect such revolutions in character constitutes the standing miracle of Christianity. Instead of the thorn shall come up the fir tree, tenderness instead of cruelty. Instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle tree, the gentle graces instead of stinging hatreds. And it shall be to the Lord for a name, indicating His nature, and for an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. The Holy Ghost, holding up to the gaze of the world specimens of His sanctifying power in the form of purified characters and inspired activities for Christ, is the ceaseless miracle worker, attesting Christian truth in an age of intense materialism, selfishness, and unbelief. God has begun to save every human soul. He has already saved the entire human race from the extinction threatened by the instantaneous execution of the death penalty upon Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, in the moment of their first transgression. The remedial dispensation began with the promise that the seed of the woman should bruise the serpent's head. The children of the pair, banished from Eden and fallen from their high estate, are born in the likeness of their sinful parents, with tremendous proclivities towards sin in the strength of their passions and the bent of their wills. Yet they come into being under the dispensation of mercy. They have a gracious ability to repent. They are saved from that complete moral inability which paralyzes the will of the fallen angels in the direction of obedience to the moral law. The ability to resist the downward tendency of their nature, and to turn from sin, is, through the influences of the Holy Spirit, procured by Jesus Christ for all the race. He will reprove the world of sin, and of righteousness, and of judgment. Through the atonement, every soul is in a salvable state. By assenting to the facts and truths of the gospel, and by relying solely on its author, every penitent sinner may be saved from the guilt of sin. If anyone fails to submit to the divine plan of salvation, the merciful purpose of God is defeated, and the initial salvation never becomes actual and final. Through an abuse of the godlike attribute of freedom, man may withstand all the suasives of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and create for himself a destiny of endless sorrow. The human will is an independent fountain of causation, itself uncaused in all its moral volitions. Whatever the good man is, he is through God and his own will. The evil man, however, is so only through his own will, for evil is falling away from God. Hence the following theological axiom of Fletcher: all damnation flows from man, all salvation flows from God. He saves all that he can without a violation of the sacred prerogative of freedom. Turn ye, why will ye die? Thus love is revealed as dominant over this world, not a fondling sentimentalism, but a holy principle, ever acting in accordance with wisdom and justice, saving the penitent, preserving believer, and consummating with flaming fire all who by incorrigible disobedience thrust from themselves the cover of the atoning blood. The extent of this conquest of love over the believing soul in the present world is a theme which has elicited intense interest through all the Christian ages. At times the grace of God has been magnified, and many have proved that He can do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, while at other times this great Christian privilege of evangelical perfection, or perfect love, has gone into an eclipse, partial or total, and the Church has groped in the darkness, benumbed by the chilling cold. End of Love Enthroned, Chapter 1. Love Revealed by Daniel Steele.
The Middy and the Moors, Chapter 1, by R. M. Ballantyne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel. The Middy and the Moors, an Algerine story. The hero is blown away, captured, crushed, comforted, and astonished. One beautiful summer night, about the beginning of the present century, a young naval officer entered the public drawing-room of a hotel at Nice, and glanced round as if in search of someone. Many people were assembled there, some in robust, others in delicate health, many in that condition which rendered it doubtful to which class they belonged, but all engaged in the quiet buzz of conversation which, in such a place, is apt to set in after dinner. The young Englishman, for such he evidently was, soon observed an elderly lady beckoning to him at the other end of the salon, and was quickly seated between her and a fragile girl, whose hand he gently took hold of. "Mother," he said to the elderly lady, "I'm going to have a row in the Mediterranean. The night is splendid, the air balmy, the stars gorgeous." "Now, George," interrupted the girl with a little smile, Don't be flowery. We know all about that." "Too bad," returned the youth. "I never rise to poetry in your presence, Minnie, without being snubbed. But you cannot cure me. Romance is too deeply ingrained in my soul. Poetry flows from me like anything. I am a midshipman in the British Navy, a position which affords scope for the wildest enthusiasm, and I'll astonish you yet. See if I don't." "I'm sure you will, dear boy," said his mother, and she believed that he would. "Of course you will," added his sister, and she at least hoped that he would. To say truth, there was nothing about the youth, as regards appearance or character, which rendered either the assurance or the hope unwarrantable. He was not tall, but he was strong and active. He was not exactly handsome, but he was possessed of a genial, hearty disposition, a playful spirit, and an earnest soul, also a modestly reckless nature, which was quite captivating. "You won't be anxious about me, mother, if I don't return till pretty late," he said, rising. "I want a good long refreshing pull, but I'll be back in time to say good night to you, Minnie, before you go to sleep." "Your leave expires on Thursday, mind," said his sister. "We cannot spare you long." "I shall be back in good time, trust me. Au revoir," he said, with a pleasant nod, as he left the room. And they did trust him, for our midshipman, George Foster, was trustworthy. But those circumstances over which people have no control are troublesome derangers of the affairs of man. That was the last the mother and sister saw of George for the space of nearly 2 years. Taking his way to the pebbly shore, young Foster hired a small boat, or punt, from a man who knew him well, declined the owner's services, pushed off, seized the oars, and rowed swiftly out to sea. It was, as he had said, a splendid night. The stars bespangled the sky like diamond dust. The water was as clear as a mirror, and the lights of Nice seemed to shoot far down into its depths. The hum of the city came off with ever-deepening softness as the distance from the shore increased. The occasional sound of oars was heard not far off, though boats and rowers were invisible, for there was no moon, and the night was dark notwithstanding the starlight. There was no fear, however, of the young sailor losing himself while the city lights formed such a glorious beacon astern. After pulling steadily for an hour or more, he rested on his oars, gazed up at the bright heavens, and then at the land lights, which by that time resembled a twinkling line on the horizon. "Must 'bout ship now," he muttered. "Won't do to keep Minnie waiting." As he rowed leisurely landward, a sudden gust of wind from the shore shivered the liquid mirror into fragments. It was the advance guard of a squall, which in a few minutes rushed down from the mountains of the Riviera, and swept out upon the darkening sea. Young Foster, as we have said, was strong. He was noted among his fellows as a splendid oarsman. The squall, therefore, did not disconcert him, though it checked his speed greatly. After 1 or 2 lulls the wind increased to a gale, and in half an hour the youth found, with some anxiety, that he was making no headway against it. The shore at that point was so much of a straight line as to render the hope of being able to slant in a faint one. As it was better, however, to attempt that than to row straight into the teeth of the gale, he diverged towards a point a little to the eastward of the port of Nice, and succeeded in making better way through the water, though he made no perceptible approach to land. "Pooh! It's only a squall. Be over in a minute," said the Middy, by way of encouraging himself, as he glanced over his shoulder at the flickering lights, which were now barely visible. He was wrong. The gale increased. Next time he glanced over his shoulder the lights were gone. Dark clouds were gathering up from the northward, and a short jabble of sea was rising, which occasionally sent a spurt of spray inboard. Feeling now that his only chance of regaining the shore lay in a strong, steady, persevering pull straight towards it, he once more turned the bow of the little boat into the wind's eye, and gave way with a will. But what could human muscle and human will, however powerful, do against a rampant nor'wester? Very soon our hero was forced to rest upon his oars from sheer exhaustion, while his boat drifted slowly out to sea. The thought of his mother and Minnie flashed upon him, and with a sudden gush, as it were, of renewed strength, he resumed his efforts, and strained his powers to the uttermost, but all in vain. Something akin to despair now seized on him, for the alternative was to drift out into the open ocean, where no friendly island lay between him and the shores of Africa. The necessity for active exertion, however, gave him no time either to rest or think. As the distance from land increased, the seas rose higher, and broke so frequently over the boat that it began to fill. To stop rowing, at least to the extent of keeping the bow to the wind, would have risked turning broadside on, and, being overturned or swamped, there was nothing, therefore, to be done in the circumstances except to keep the boat's head to the wind and drift. In the midst of the rushing gale and surging seas, he sat there, every gleam of hope almost extinguished, when there came to his mind a brief passage from the Bible, "Hope thou in God." Many a time had his mother tried, in days gone by, to impress that text on his mind, but apparently without success. Now it rose before him like a beacon star. At the same time he thought of the possibility that he might be seen and picked up by a passing vessel. He could not but feel, however, that the chances of this latter event occurring were small indeed, for a passing ship or boat would not only be going at great speed, but would be very unlikely to see his cockle-shell in the darkness, or to hear his cry in the roaring gale. Still he grasped that hope as the drowning man is said to clutch at a straw. And the hope was quickly fulfilled, for scarcely had another half-hour elapsed when he observed a sail, a high-peaked sail peculiar to some Mediterranean craft, rise, ghost-like, out of the driving foam and spray. The vessel was making almost straight for him. He knew that it would pass before there could be time to heave a rope. At the risk of being run down, he rowed the punt in front of it, as if courting destruction, but at the same time guided his little craft so skilfully that it passed close to leeward, where the vessel's bulwarks were dipping into the water. Our Middy's aim was so exact that the vessel only grazed the boat as it flew past. In that moment, young Foster sprang with the agility of a cat, capsized the boat with the impulse, caught the bulwarks and rigging of the vessel, and in another moment stood panting on her deck.
"Hello, Neptune, what do you want here?" cried a gruff voice at Foster's elbows.
At the same time a powerful hand grasped his throat, and a lantern was thrust in his face. "Let go, and I will tell you," gasped the youth, restraining his indignation at such unnecessary violence. The grasp tightened, however, instead of relaxing.
"Speak out, baby-face," roared the voice, referring, in the latter expression, no doubt, to our hero's juvenility.
Instead of speaking out, George Foster hit out, and the voice with the lantern went down into the lee scuppers. Then, the glare of the lantern being removed from his eyes, George saw, by the light of the binnacle lamp, that his adversary, a savage-looking Turk, at least in dress, was gathering himself up for a rush, and that the steersman, a huge negro, was grinning from ear to ear.
"Go below,"
said a deep, stern voice in the Arabic tongue. The effect of this order was to cause the Turk with the broken lantern to change his mind, and retire with humility, while it solemnized the negro steersman's face almost miraculously. The speaker was the captain of the vessel, a man of grave demeanour, Herculean mould, and clothed in picturesque Eastern costume. Turning with quiet politeness to Foster, he asked him in broken French how he had come on board. The youth explained in French quite as much broken as that of his interrogator. "Do you speak English?" he added. To this the captain replied in English, still more shattered than his French, that he could "ver leetle," but that as he, the youth, was a prisoner, there would be no occasion for speech at all, the proper attitude of a prisoner being that of absolute silence and obedient to orders. "A prisoner!" ejaculated Foster, on recovering from the first shock of surprise. "Do you know that I am an officer in the navy of His Majesty the King of Great Britain?" A gleam of satisfaction lighted up the swarthy features of the Turk for a moment, as he replied,
"Ver good, ransom all the more greater."
As he spoke, a call from the lookout at the bow of the vessel induced him to hurry forward.
At the same instant, a slight hissing sound caused Foster to turn to the steersman, whose black face was alive with intelligence, while an indescribable hitch up of his chin seemed to beckon the youth to approach with caution. Foster perceived at once that the man wished his communication, whatever it was, to be observed by no one. He therefore moved towards him as if merely to glance at the compass. "Massa," said the negro, without looking at Foster, or changing a muscle of his now stolid visage, "you's in a drefful fix. Dis here am a pirate, but I's not a pirate. Bress you, I's was no dat. I's a awful hypocrite, and I wants to give you good advice. Whatever you do, don't resist. You'll only get whacked if you do." "Thank you, Sambo. But what if I do resist in spite of being whacked?" "Den you'll very soon change your mind, dat's all. Moreover, my name's not Sambo, it am Peter the Great." As he said so, Peter the Great drew himself up to his full height, and he drew himself up to 6 feet 4 when he did that. The captain, coming aft at the moment, put an abrupt end to the conversation. 2 powerful Moorish seamen accompanied him. These, without uttering a word, seized Foster by the arms. In the strength of his indignation, our Middy was on the point of commencing a tremendous struggle, when Peter the Great's "Don't resist," and the emphasis with which it had been spoken, came to mind, and he suddenly gave in. His hands were tied behind his back, and he was led down into a small, dimly lighted cabin, where, being permitted to sit down on a locker, he was left to his own reflections. These were by no means agreeable, as may well be supposed, for now he knew that he had fallen into the hands of those pests, the Algerine pirates, who at that time infested the Mediterranean. With the thoughtlessness of youth, Foster had never troubled his mind much about the piratical city of Algiers. Of course he knew that it was a stronghold on the northern coast of Africa, inhabited by Moorish rascals, who, taking advantage of their position, issued from their port, and pounced upon merchantmen that entered the Mediterranean, confiscating their cargoes and enslaving their crews and passengers, or holding them to ransom. He also knew, or had heard, that some of the great maritime powers paid subsidies to the Dey of Algiers, to allow the vessels of their respective nations to come and go unmolested, but he could scarcely credit the latter fact. It seemed to him, as indeed it was, preposterous. "For," said he to the brother Middy, who had given them the information, "would not the nations whom the Dey had the impudence to tax join their fleets together, pay him an afternoon visit one fine day, and blow him and his Moors and Turks and city into a heap of rubbish?" What, the Middy replied, we have no means of knowing, but certain it is that his information was correct, for some of the principal nations did, at that time, submit to the degradation of this tax, and they did not unite their fleets for the extinction of the pirates. Poor George Foster now began to find out that the terrible truths which he had refused to believe were indeed great realities, and had now begun to affect himself. He experienced an awful sinking of the heart when it occurred to him that no one would ever know anything about his fate, for the little boat would be sure to find bottom up, sooner or later, and it would of course be assumed that he had been drowned. Shall it be said that the young midshipman was weak, or wanting in courage, because he bowed his head and wept when the full force of his condition came home to him? Nay, verily, for there was far more of grief for the prolonged agony that was in store for his mother and sister than for the fate that awaited himself. He prayed as well as wept. "God help me and them!" he exclaimed aloud. The prayer was brief but sincere, perhaps the more sincere because so brief. At all events it was that acknowledgment of utter helplessness which secures the help of the almighty arm. Growing weary at last, he stretched himself on the locker, and with the facility of robust health, fell into a sound sleep. Youth, strength, and health are not easily incommoded by wet garments. Besides, the weather was unusually warm at the time. How long he slept he could not tell, but the sun was high when he awoke, and his clothes were quite dry. Other signs there were that he had slept long, such as the steadiness of the breeze, and the more regular motion of the vessel, which showed that the gale was over, and the sea going down. There was also a powerful sensation in what he styled his bread-basket, though it might, with equal truth, have been called his meat and vegetable basket,
which told him more eloquently than anything else of the lapse of time. Rising from his hard couch, and endeavouring to relieve the aching of the bound arms by change of position, he observed that the cabin hatch was open, and that nothing prevented his going on deck, if so disposed. Accordingly he ascended, though with some difficulty, owing to his not having been trained to climb a ladder in a rough sea without the use of his hands. A Moor, he observed, had taken his friend Peter the Great's place at the tiller, and the captain stood near the stern, observing a passing vessel. A stiffish but steady breeze carried them swiftly over the waves, which, we might say, laughingly reflected the bright sunshine and the deep blue sky. Several vessels of different rigs and nationalities were sailing in various directions, both near and far away. Going straight to the captain with an air of good-humoured sang-froid, which was peculiar to him, Foster said, "Captain, don't you think I've had these bits of rope yarn on my wrists long enough? I'm not used, you see, to walking the deck without the use of my hands, and a heavy lurch, like as not, would send me slap into the lee scuppers, sailor though I be. Besides, I won't jump overboard without leave, you may rely upon that. Neither will I attempt, single-handed, to fight your entire crew, so you needn't be afraid." The stern Moor evidently understood part of this speech, and he was so tickled with the last remark, that his habitual gravity gave place to the faintest flicker of a smile, while a twinkle gleamed for a moment in his eye. Only for a moment, however. Pointing over the side, he bade his prisoner look. Foster looked, and beheld, in the far distance, a three-masted vessel that seemed to bear a strong resemblance to a British man-of-war. "You promise," said the captain, "not shout or roar." "I promise," answered our Middy, "neither to shout nor roar, for my doing either, even though like a bull of Bashan, would be of no earthly use at this distance." "Englishmans," said the captain, "niver brook the word." After paying this scarcely deserved compliment, he gave an order to a sailor who was coiling up ropes near him, and the man at once proceeded to untie Foster's bonds. "My good fellow," said the midshipman, observing that his liberator was the man whom he had knocked down the night before, "I'm sorry I had to floor you, but it was impossible to help it, you know. An Englishman is like a bulldog. He won't suffer himself to be seized by the throat and choked if he can help it." The Turk, who was evidently a renegade Briton, made no reply whatever to this address, but, after casting the lashings loose, returned to his former occupation. Foster proceeded to thank the captain for his courtesy, and made him acquainted with the state of his appetite, but he was evidently not in a conversational frame of mind. Before a few words had been spoken, the captain stopped him, and, pointing down the skylight, said sharply, "Breakfast! Go!" Both look and tone admonished our hero to obey. He descended to the cabin, therefore, without finishing his sentence, and there discovered that "breakfast" consisted of 2 sea biscuits and a mug of water. To these dainties he applied himself with infinite relish, for he had always been Spartan-like as to the quality of his food, and hunger makes almost any kind of dish agreeable. While thus engaged he heard a hurried trampling of feet on deck, mingled with sharp orders from the captain. At first he thought the sounds might have been reference to taking in a reef to prepare for a squall, but as the noise rather increased, his curiosity was aroused, and he was about to return on deck when Peter the Great suddenly leaped into the cabin, and took hurriedly from the opposite locker a brace of highly ornamented pistols and a scimitar. "What's wrong, Peter?" asked Foster, starting up. "We's a-going to fight," groaned the negro. "Oh, I's an awful hypocrite. You stop where you are, massa, or else you'll get whacked." Despite the risk of being whacked, the youth would have followed the negro on deck, had not the hatch been slammed in his face and secured. Next moment he heard a volley of musketry on deck. It was instantly replied to by a distant volley, and immediately thereafter groans and curses showed that the firing had not been without effect. That the pirate had engaged a vessel of some sort was evident, and our hero, being naturally anxious to see if not to share in the fight, tried hard to get out of his prison, but without success. He was obliged, therefore, to sit there inactive and listen to the wild confusion overhead. At last there came a crash, followed by fiercer shouts and cries. He knew that the vessels had met, and that the pirates were boarding. In a few minutes comparative silence ensued, broken only by occasional footsteps and the groaning of the wounded. End of the Middy and the Moors, Chapter 1, by R.M. Ballantyne.
The Pagan's Cup, Chapter 1, Modern Arcadia, by Fergus Hume. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by MaryAnn. Certain portions of England yet remain undiscovered by Americans and uncivilized by railways. Colster village, above King's Meadows, in a county which need not be named, is one of these unknown spots. No doubt before long the bicycle and the motor car will enliven its somnolent neighborhood, but at present it is free from the summer jaunts of tourists. With this neglect, the Colster folk profess themselves satisfied. They have no wish to come into contact with the busy world. This prejudice against intrusion dates from medieval times, when strangers rarely came to the village with peaceful intentions. Even now a chance comer is looked upon with suspicion. Mr. Richard Pratt said something of this sort to the vicar during a morning ramble, some 6 weeks after he had taken up his residence in the nun's house. With the parson and the gentry of the parish, Mr. Pratt agreed very well, his respectability having been vouched for by Mrs. Gabriel, the lady of the manor. But the villagers still held aloof, although the newcomer did his best to overcome their churlish doubts. They did not credit his story that he had settled in Colster to pass his remaining years in peace, and even the money he scattered so freely could not buy their loyalty. Pratt had never met with such people before. In most countries, an open purse invites an open heart, but the Colster villagers were above mammon worship. Such an experience was refreshing to Pratt, and introduced him to a new type of humanity. "The first place I ever struck in which the dollar is not all-powerful," he said, with his Yankee twang and pleasant laugh. "We are not sufficiently educated in that respect," replied Mr. Tempest in his simple way. "For my part, I am not ill-pleased that my parishioners should refuse to worship the golden calf." "There is no calf about me, I guess," said Pratt, grimly, "and very little gold. I don't say I haven't a decent income, but as to being a millionaire, no, sir." "In the kingdom of the blind the one-eyed is king, Mr. Pratt. You are a millionaire in this poor place, but I fear you find it dull." "Why, no, vicar. I'm glad to be out of the buzz. The world's made up of nerves and machinery nowadays. At 52 years of age I can't stand the racket. This Sleepy Hollow's good enough for me to stay in until I peg out. Guess I'll buy an allotment in that graveyard of yours." "Hollow," said the vicar, smiling, "and our earthly dwelling-place is set up on a hill. Mr. Pratt, I suspect you have Irish blood in your veins." Pratt laughed, and being to a large extent devoid of humour, explained earnestly that he had used the word figuratively. "Washington Irving, Rip Van Winkle," he explained, nodding, whereat the vicar smiled again. The situation of Colster was striking and strange. A green-clothed promontory extended abruptly from the high tableland into King's Meadow. To right and left chalky cliffs of considerable height flared away for miles, forming a buttress to the moors above and walls to the plain below. In prehistoric ages, the ocean waves had beaten against these cliffs, but, gradually receding, had left dry the miles upon miles of fertile lands now called King's Meadows. An appanage of the crown, they had been called so from the days of William the Conqueror. From where they stood, the vicar and his friend had a bird's-eye view of this desirable land, unrolled like a map under the bright June sky. League after league of cornfields stretched away to the clear, shining line of ocean, and amidst the ripening grain appeared red-roofed villages, clumps of trees, the straight lines of dusty white roads, and the winding, glittering serpent of the river. And as a background to this smiling plenty, if so Irish an expression can be permitted, was the blue expanse of the Channel dotted with the white sails of merchantmen. A small wood of ancient oaks shut off the purple-clad moor from the spur upon which Colster was built. On the verge of this, yet encircled by trees, stood the village church, a crusading chapel, dedicated to St. Gabriel the Messenger. Thence the ground fell away gradually, and spread out into a broad neck of land, down the centre of which ran a road leading from chapel to village. On either side of this, amidst oaks and elms and sycamores, were the houses of the gentry. From where they ended the promontory rose into 2 rounded hills with a slight depression between. On the one to the left the village was built, its houses cramped within a tumble-down wall dating from the days when it was needed as a defence. The other hill was surmounted by a well-preserved castle, the keep of which with its flag could be seen above the oak woods. This was inhabited by Mrs. Gabriel, the sole representative of the feudal lords of Colchester. Yet she was only the childless widow of the last baron, and had none of the fierce Gabriel blood in her veins. The once powerful and prolific family was extinct. From castle and village, steps led down into the depression between the 2 hills. Down this continued the chapel road, sloping gradually with many windings to the plains below. The whole place had the look of some Rhenish robber-hold. And if tradition was to be trusted, the Gabriel lords had dwelt like eagles in their eyrie, swooping down at intervals to harry and plunder, burn and slay the peaceful folk of the plains. A turbulent and aggressive race, the Gabriels. It had defied king and priest, and parliament and people. Time alone had ever conquered it. A survival of the Middle Ages, said Mr. Tempest, pointing out these things to his companion. It was needful that the Gabriel barons should build strong defences. They were fierce and bloodthirsty, defiant of law and order. For many centuries they were a scourge to the inhabitants of the plains. These often complained to the king, and several times the place was besieged, but without result. The Gabriels kept their hold of it. The only thing they ever lost was their title. A bill of attainder was passed against them in the time of the 2nd George. After that they became less lions than foxes. Just so, said Mr. Pratt. This place couldn't do much against artillery, I guess. And even in the bow and arrow days, a strong force coming over the moor and down the spur. That was often tried, interrupted Tempest quickly, but the attempts always failed. In the days of Henry II, Aylmer Gabriel beat back an overwhelming force, and then erected the chapel as a thanksgiving. The Archangel Gabriel was the patron saint of the family, and the chapel is dedicated to him. He couldn't keep the family from dying out, however, said Pratt, as they moved towards the village. No, with the late John Gabriel the family became extinct, but I dare say Mrs. Gabriel will arrange that her adopted son succeeds. He can take the name and the coat of arms. I should be very pleased to see that, added the vicar, half to himself. Leo is a good fellow, and would make an excellent landlord. The eyes of the American flashed when the name was mentioned, but he made only a careless comment. Leo Haverley, he said, after a pause. He's a right smart young chap, sure. Who is he? The son of Mrs. Gabriel's brother. She was a Miss Haverley, you know. I believe her brother was somewhat dissipated, and died abroad. The boy arrived here when he was 3 years of age, and Mrs. Gabriel adopted him. He will be her heir. Is there anyone to object? Asked Pratt eagerly. The vicar shook his head. The Gabriels are absolutely extinct. Failing Leo, the estates would lapse to the crown. In the old days they would have been seized by the king in any case, as the sovereigns were always anxious to hold this point of vantage which dominated the lands below. But we live in such law-abiding times that Mrs. Gabriel, although not of the blood of the family, can leave the estates to whomsoever she will. I understand that she has quite decided Leo shall inherit and take the name, also the coat of arms. She doesn't strike me as over-fond of the boy, said Pratt, as they climbed the crooked street. Rather a hard woman, I should say. Mrs. Gabriel has a particularly high moral standard, replied the vicar, evasively, and she wishes all to attain to it. Leo, he hesitated. He's no worse than a boy ought to be, said the American cheerily. Your young saint makes an old sinner. That's so, vicar. Mr. Tempest laughed outright. I fear there is small chance of Leo becoming a saint, either young or old, he said, though he is a good lad in many ways. Wild, I admit, but his heart is in the right place. Pratt smiled to himself. He knew that Leo was in love with Sybil, the daughter of this prosy old archaeologist. Simple as Mr. Tempest was, he could not be blind to the possibility of his daughter making such an excellent match. Oh, yes, laughed Pratt, knowingly. I'm sure his heart is in the right place. But by this time the vicar was on his hobby horse, and did not gauge the significance of the speech. Here, he said, waving his hand towards the four sides of the square in which they stood, the Romans built a camp. It crowned this hill, and was garrisoned by the 10th Legion to overawe the turbulent tribes swarming on the plains below. In fact, this town is built within the camp, as the name shows. How does it show that? Asked Pratt, more to keep the vicar talking than because he cared. The name, man, the name. It's properly Colster, but by usage has been shortened to Colster. Colne comes from the Latin colonia, a colony, and castor, or cester, is derived from castra, a camp. Colncester, therefore, means the camp colony, which proves that the original builders of this town erected their dwellings within the circumvallation of the great original castra of Claudian. If you will come with me, Mr. Pratt, I will show you the remains of this great work. I have seen it several times before, replied Pratt, rather bored by this archaeological disquisition. I know every inch of this place. It doesn't take an American centuries to get round, and 6 weeks of walking have fixed me up in your local geography. But there's the chapel, Vicar. We might walk up there. I'd like to hear a few remarks on the subject of the chapel. Interesting. Oh, I guess so. Certainly, said Tempest absently. Let us walk. Walk. And he strolled away with his hands in his tailcoat pockets, looking something like an elderly jackdaw. Indeed, the churchman, with his lean oval face, his large spectacles, and the fluttering black garments on his thin figure, very much resembled a bird. He was scholarly, well-bred and gentle, but wholly unworldly. Since his wife had died 7 years before, Sybil had taken charge of the house. Harold Ralston, the energetic curate, looked after the parish. But for these two, both clerical and domestic affairs would have been neglected, so immersed was Mr. Tempest in his dry-as-dust explorations. Many people said openly that the vicar was past his work and should be pensioned off. Mrs. Gabriel, a capable and managing woman, had once hinted as much to him, but the usually placid parson had flown into such a rage that she had hastily withdrawn herself and her suggestion. There is nothing more terrible than the rebellion of a sheep. Mrs. Gabriel recalled this remark of Balzac's when Tempest, proving himself worthy of his name, swept her in wrath from his study. Pratt was quite another specimen of humanity, a neat, dapper, suave little man, undersized yet perfectly proportioned. He had black hair, black eyes, and a clean-shaven face, which constantly wore an expression of imperturbable good humour. His dress was too neat for the country. A blue serge suit, white spats on brown boots, a Panama hat, gloves, and, what he was never without, a smoothly rolled umbrella. Spick and span he might have stepped out of a glass case, and this was his invariable appearance. No one ever saw Pratt unshaven or untidy. He had been everywhere, had seen everything, and was a most engaging companion, never out of temper and never bored. But for all his smiling ways the villagers held aloof from him. Wishing to break down their barrier of prejudice, the sharp little American had attached himself to the vicar during the good man's usual morning walk. He thought that such a sight might dispose the villagers to relent. I shall not vary my usual walk, remarked Mr. Tempest, positively. We will stroll through the village, return to the chapel, and then, Mr. Pratt, I hope you will lunch with me. Delighted, if it will not put Miss Sybil out. No, no. My wife is always prepared for chance visitors, answered the vicar, quite oblivious to the fact that the late Mrs. Tempest was resting in the churchyard. Ha, this is Mrs. Gill. How do you do, Mrs. Gill? Mrs. Gill was in excellent health, and said so with a curtsy. A dumpy, rosy-faced woman was Mrs. Gill, with a pair of extremely wicked black eyes, which snapped fire when she was angered. She had a temper, but rarely displayed it, for it suited her better to gain her ends by craft rather than force. 15 years ago she had appeared from nowhere to settle as a midwife in Colster. Contrary to their usual fashion, the villagers had taken her to their bosoms. This was owing to the clever way Mrs. Gill had of managing them, and to her knowledge of herbs. She had cured many sick people whom the doctor had given up, and consequently was not looked upon with favour by Dr. James, who had succeeded to the family practice. But even he could not be angry at rosy, laughing Mrs. Gill. Though I don't like her, confessed Dr. James. The devil looks out of her eyes. Dangerous woman, very dangerous. Pratt had no chance of proving this remark of the doctor's to be true, for Mrs. Gill never looked at him. She kept her wicked eyes on the kindly Victor and smiled constantly, punctuating such smiles with an occasional curtsy. "Pearl is not with you?" said Mr. Tempest. "No, bless her poor heart!" cried Mrs. Gill. "She is up at the chapel. Her favourite place is the chapel, as your reverence knows." "She might have a worse place to haunt, Mrs. Gill. Poor soul! Poor, mad, innocent child!" "Do you call 18 years of age childish, Mr. Tempest?" asked the woman. "No, no. I speak of her mind, her poor weak mind. She is still a child. I beg of you to look after her, Mrs. Gill. We must make her path as pleasant as we may." "Then I beg your reverence will tell that Barker to leave her alone." "Barker? Barker? Ah, yes, the sexton. Of course. Worthy man." Mrs. Gill sniffed. "He won't let her stay in the chapel," she said. "Tut, tut. This must be seen to. Poor Pearl is God's child, Mrs. Gill, so she has a right to rest in his house. Yes, yes, I'll see to it. A good day, Mrs. Gill." The woman dropped a curtsy, and for the first time shot a glance at Pratt, who smiled blandly. A nervous expression crossed her face as she caught his eye. The next moment she drew herself up and passed on, crossing herself. Pratt looked after her, still smiling, then hurried to rejoin the vicar, who began to explain in his usual wandering way. "A good woman, Mrs. Gill. A good woman," he said. "For some years she has had charge of Pearl Dairy, whom she rescued from her cruel father." "Is that the insane girl?" said Pratt idly. "Do not talk of one so afflicted in that way, Mr. Pratt. Pearl may not be quite right in her head, but she is sane enough to conduct herself properly. If the fact that she is not all herself reached Portfront, the principal town of the county, it is possible that the authorities might wish to shut her up, and that would be the death of Pearl." "No, no," said the good vicar. "Let her have a fair share of God's beautiful earth, and live to a happy old age. In this quiet place we can afford one natural." "Like the village idiot we read about in Scotch tales," said Pratt. "Just so, Mr. Pratt. In Waverley there is such a one. Pearl Dairy is quite harmless, and really has a beautiful nature. Mrs. Gill is much to be commended for her charity." "She looks a charitable woman," said the American, but whether he meant this ironically or not it is hard to say. The women of Colchester were mostly lace workers, and toiled at this fairy-like craft while their husbands worked in the fields below. During 3 seasons the mountain men, as they might be called, ploughed the meadowland, sowed the corn, and helped to reap and harvest it. In the winter they returned to live on their earnings and take a holiday. But the women worked all the year through, and Colchester lace was famous. As the vicar and Pratt walked down the street, at the door of every house sat a woman with her pillow and pins, dexterously making the filmy fabric which was destined to adorn the dress of many a London beauty. They were mostly serious-looking, and some even grim, but all had a smile for the vicar, although they pursed their lips when they saw the good-natured face of Mr. Pratt. Most unaccountable this dislike they had for the American. He was rather annoyed by his pronounced unpopularity. "I must really do something to make them like me," he said, much vexed. "Tut, tut," replied the vicar. "Liking will come in good time, Mr. Pratt. It takes some years for them to fancy a stranger. I was an object of distrust to them for quite 3. Now they are devoted to me." "And have you been here long?" "About 40 years," said Tempest. "I have buried many and christened most. We have no Methodists in Colchester, Mr. Pratt. Everyone comes to church and worships according to the rites of the Anglican communion, as is fit and proper." "I suppose you are a prosperous community on the whole?" So. Nothing to complain of. The lace made here by these clever fingers sells well in London and even abroad. Then the men earn a fair wage in King's Meadows. Mrs. Gabriel looks after the few poor we have amongst us. On the whole, we have much to be thankful for, Mr. Pratt." Thus talking, the good vicar led his companion round by the mouldering walls, where they could look down to the plains. After a glance they re-entered the town, and walked through the cobbled-stoned streets, between the quaint high-roofed houses. Everywhere the vicar was greeted, and Pratt frowned upon. He was quite glad when they descended from the village through the old gate, and after walking along the Neck, which was the fashionable part of Colchester, began to climb up towards the chapel. "A most delightful spot," said Pratt politely, "but I guess the folk don't cotton to me. I must make them freeze on somehow. End of The Pagan's Cup, Chapter 1, A Modern Arcadia, by Fergus Hume.
Pan, Chapter 1, by Knut Hamsun. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Chapter 1. These last few days I've been thinking and thinking of the Nordland summer, with its endless day. Sitting here thinking of that, and of a hut I lived in, and of the woods behind the hut, and writing things down by way of passing the time to amuse myself, no more. The time goes very slowly. I cannot get it to pass as quickly as I would, though I have nothing to sorrow for, and live as pleasantly as could be. I am well content with all, and my 30 years are no age to speak of. A few days back someone sent me 2 feathers, 2 birds' feathers in a sheet of notepaper with a coronet, and fastened with a seal, sent from a place a long way off, from one who need not have sent them back at all. That amused me too, those devilish green feathers. And for the rest I have no troubles, unless for a touch of gout now and again in my left foot, and from an old bullet wound, healed long since. 2 years ago, I remember, the time passed quickly, beyond all comparison more quickly than time now. A summer was gone before I knew. 2 years ago it was, in 1855. I will write of it just to amuse myself, of something that happened to me, or something I dreamed. Now I have forgotten many things belonging to that time, by having scarcely thought of them since, but I remember that the nights were very light, and many things seemed curious and unnatural. 12 months to the year, but night was like day, and never a star to be seen in the sky. And the people I met were strange, and of a different nature from those I had known before. Sometimes a single night was enough to make them blossom out from childhood into the full of their glory, ripe and fully grown. No witchery in this, only I had never seen the like before. No. In a white, roomy home down by the sea, I met one who busied my thoughts for a little time. I do not always think of her now, not any more. No, I have forgotten her. But I think of all the other things, the cry of the seabirds, my hunting in the woods, my nights, and all the warm hours of that summer. After all, it was only by the merest accident I happened to meet her. Save for that, she would never have been in my thoughts for a day. From the hut where I lived I could see a confusion of rocks and reefs and islets, and a little of the sea, and a bluish mountain peak or so. Behind the hut was the forest. A huge forest it was, and I was glad and grateful beyond measure for the scent of roots and leaves, the thick smell of the fir sap, that is like the smell of marrow. Only the forest could bring all things to calm within me. My mind was strong and at ease. Day after day I tramped over the wooded hills with Æsop at my side, and asked no more than leave to keep on going there day after day, though most of the ground was covered still with snow and soft slush. I had no company but Æsop. Now it's Cora, but at that time it was Æsop, my dog, that I afterwards shot. Often in the evening when I came back to the hut after being out shooting all day, I could feel that kindly, homely feeling trickling through me, from head to foot, a pleasant little inward shivering. And I would talk to Æsop about it, saying how comfortable we were. "There, now we'll get a fire going and roast a bird on the hearth," I would say. "What do you say to that?" And when it was done and we had both fed, Æsop would slip away to his place behind the hearth, while I lit a pipe and lay down on the bench for a while, listening to the dead soughing of the trees. There was a slight breeze, bearing down towards the hut, and I could hear quite clearly the clutter of a grouse far away on the ridge behind. Save for that, all was still. And many a time I fell asleep there as I lay, just as I was, fully dressed and all, and did not wake till the seabirds began calling. And then looking out of the window I could see the big white buildings of the trading station, the landing stage at Girilund, the store where I used to get my bread. And I would lie there a while, wondering how I came to be there, in a hut on the fringe of a forest, away up in Nordland. Then Æsop over by the hearth would shake out his long, slender body, rattling his collar and yawning and wagging his tail, and I would jump up, after those 3 or 4 hours of sleep, fully rested, and full of joy and everything. Many a night passed just that way. End of Pan, Chapter 1, by Knut Hamsun.
A Study of Hawthorne, Chapter 1, Point of View, by George Parsons Lathrop. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. This book was not designed as a biography, but is rather a portrait. And to speak more carefully still, it is not so much this as my conception of what a portrait of Hawthorne should be. For I cannot write with the authority of one who had known him and had been formally entrusted with the task of describing his life. On the other hand, I do not enter upon this attempt as a mere literary performance, but have been assisted in it by an inward impulse, a consciousness of sympathy with the subject, which I may perhaps consider a sort of inspiration. My guide has been intuition, confirmed and seldom confuted by research. Perhaps it is even a favoring fact that I should never have seen Mr. Hawthorne. A personality so elusive as his may possibly yield its traits more readily to one who can never obtrude actual intercourse between himself and the mind he is meditating upon. An honest report upon personal contact always has a value denied to the reviews of aftercomers, yet the best criticism and biography is not always that of contemporaries. Our first studies will have a biographical scope, because a certain grouping of facts is essential to give point to the view which I am endeavoring to present, and as Hawthorne's early life has hitherto been but little explored, much of the material used in the earlier chapters is now for the first time made public. The latter portion of the career may be treated more sketchily, being already better known, though passages will be found throughout the essay which have been developed with some fullness in order to maintain a correct atmosphere, compensating any errors which mere opinions might lead to. Special emphasis, then, must not be held to show neglect of points which my space and scope prevent my commenting on. But the first outline requiring our attention involves a distant retrospect. The history of Hawthorne's genius is in some sense a summary of all New England history. From amid a simple, practical, energetic community, remarkable for its activity in affairs of state and religion, but by no means given to dreaming, this fair flower of American genius rose up unexpectedly enough, breaking the cold New England sod for the emission of a light and fragrance as pure and pensive as that of the arbutus in our woods in spring. The flower, however, sprang from seed that rooted in the old colonial life of the sternly imaginative Pilgrims and Puritans. Thrusting itself up into view through the drift of a later day, it must not be confounded with other growths, nourished only by that more recent deposit, though the surface drift had of course its own weighty influence in the nourishment of it. The artistic results of a period of action must sometimes be looked for at a point of time long subsequent, and this was especially sure to be so in the first phases of New England civilization. The settlers in this region, in addition to the burdens and obstacles proffered to pioneers, had to deal with the cares of forming a model state, and of laying out for posterity a straight and solid path in which it might walk with due rectitude. All this was in itself an ample enough subject to occupy their powerful imaginations. They were enacting a kind of sacred epic, the dangers and the dignity and the exaltation of which they felt most fervently. The Bible, the Bay Psalm Book, Bunyan, and Milton, the poems of George Wither, Baxter's Saints' Rest, and some controversial pamphlets would suffice to appease whatever yearnings the immense experiment of their lives failed to satisfy. Gradually, of course, the native press and newcomers from England multiplied books in a community which held letters in unusual reverence. But the continuous work of subduing a new country, the dependence upon the motherland for general literature, and finally the excitements of the Revolutionary period, deferred the opportunity for any aesthetic expression of the forces that had been at work here ever since Winthrop stepped from the Arbella onto the shore of the New World, with noble manliness and sturdy statesmanship enough in him to uphold the whole future of a great people. When Hawthorne came, therefore, his utterance was a culmination of the two preceding centuries. An entire side of the richly endowed human nature to which we owe the high qualities of New England, a nature which is often so easily disposed of as meagre, cold, narrow, and austere. This side, long suppressed and thrown into shade by the more active front, found expression at last in these pages, so curiously compounded of various elements, answering to those traits of the past which Hawthorne's genius revived. The sensuous substance of the early New England character had piously surrendered to the severe maxims which religion and prudence imposed, and so complete was its suppression that all this part of Puritan nature missed recording itself, except by chance glimpses through the history of the times. For this voluntary oblivion it has been rarely compensated in the immortality it meets with through Hawthorne. Not that he set himself with forethought to the illustration of it, but, in studying as poet and dramatist the past from which he himself had issued, he sought, naturally, to light it up from the interior, to possess himself of the very fire which burned in men's breasts and set their minds in movement at that epoch. In his own person and his own blood, the same elements, the same capabilities still existed, however modified or differently ordered. The records of Massachusetts Bay are full of suggestive incongruities between the ideal, single-souled life which its founders hoped to lead and the jealousies, the opposing opinions, or the intervolved passions of individuals and of parties, which sometimes unwittingly cloaked themselves in religious tenets. Placing himself in the position of these beings, then, and conscious of all the strong and various potencies of emotion which his own nature, inherited from them, held in curb, it was natural that Hawthorne should give weight to this contrast between the intense, prisoned life of shut sensibilities and the formal outward appearance to which it was moulded. This indeed is a source of motive in much of his writing, notably so in The Scarlet Letter. It is thus that his figures get their tremendous and often terrible relief. They are seen as close as we see our faces in a glass, and brought so intimately into our consciousness that the throbbing of their passions sounds like the mysterious internal beating of our own hearts in our own ears. And even when he is not dealing directly with themes or situations closely related to that life, there may be felt in his style, I think, particularly in that of the Twice-Told Tales, a union of vigorous freedom and graceful, shy restraint, a mingling of guardedness which verges on severity with a quick and delicately thrilled sensibility for all that is rich and beautiful and generous, which is his by right of inheritance from the race of nonconformist colonizers. How subtle and various this sympathy is between himself and the past of his people, we shall see more clearly as we go on. Salem was, in fact, Hawthorne's native soil, in all senses, as intimately and perfectly so as Florence was the only soil in which Dante and Michelangelo could have had their growth. It is endlessly suggestive, this way that historic cities have of expressing themselves for all time in the persons of one or two men. Silently and with mysterious precision, the genius comes to birth and ripens, sometimes despite all sorts of discouragement, into a full bloom, which we afterward see could not have reached its maturity at any other time, and would surely have missed its most peculiar and cherished qualities if reared in any other place. The Ionian intellect of Athens culminates in Plato. Florence runs into the mold of Dante's verse like fluid bronze. Paris secures remembrance of her wide curiosity in Voltaire's settled expression. And Samuel Johnson holds fast for us that London of the 18th century which has passed out of sight, in giving place to the capital of the Anglo-Saxon race today. In like manner, the sober little New England town, which has played a so much more obscure, though in its way hardly less significant part, sits quietly enshrined and preserved in Hawthorne's singularly imperishable prose. Of course, Salem is not to be compared with Florence, otherwise and remotely or partially. Florence was naturally the city of flowers, in a figurative sense as well as in the common meaning. Its splendid, various, and full-pulsed life found spontaneous issue in magnificent works of art, in architecture, painting, poetry, and sculpture, things in which New England was quite sterile. Salem evolved the artistic spirit indirectly, and embodied itself in Hawthorne by the force of contrast. The weariness of unadorned life, which must have oppressed many a silent soul before him, at last gathered force for a revolt in his person, and the very dearth which had previously reigned was made to contribute to the beauty of his achievement. The unique and delicate perfume of surprise with which his genius issued from its crevice still haunts his romances. A quality of homeliness dwells in their very strangeness and rarity, which endears them to us unspeakably, and captivates the foreign sense as well, so that one of Hawthorne's chief and most enduring charms is in a measure due to that very barrenness of his native earth, which would at first seem to offer only denial to his development. It is in this direction that we catch sight of the analogy between his intellectual unfolding and that of the great Florentines. It consists in his drawing up into himself the nourishment furnished by the ground upon which he was born, and making the more and the less productive elements reach a climax of characteristic beauty. One marked difference, however, is that there was no abundant and inspiriting municipal life of his own time which could enter into his genius. It was the consciousness of the past of the place that affected him. He himself has expressed as much. This old town of Salem, my native place, though I have dwelt much away from it, both in boyhood and maturer years, possesses or did possess a hold on my affections, the force of which I have never realized during my seasons of actual residence here. And yet, though invariably happiest elsewhere, there is within me a feeling for old Salem, which, in lack of a better phrase, I must be content to call affection. But the sentiment has likewise its moral quality. The figure of that first ancestor, invested by family tradition with a dim and dusky grandeur, was present to my boyish imagination as far back as I can remember. It still haunts me, and induces a kind of home feeling with the past, which I scarcely claim in reference to the present phase of the town. It is by briefly reviewing that past, then trying to reproduce in imagination the immediate atmosphere of Hawthorne's youth, and comparing the two, that we shall best arrive at the completion of our proposed portrait. We have first to study the dim perspective and the suggestive coloring of that historic background from which the author emerges, and then to define clearly his own individual traits as they appear in his published works and notebooks. The eagerness which admirers of such genius show to learn all permissible details of his personal history is, when freed from the vulgar and imbecile curiosity which often mars it, a sort of homage that it is right to satisfy. It is a respect apt to be paid only to men whose winning personal qualities have reached through their writing and touched a number of grateful and appreciative hearts. But two objections may be urged against giving such details here. One is that Hawthorne especially disapproved the writing of a life of himself. The other, that the history of Salem and the works of Hawthorne are easily accessible to anyone without intervention. Of the first, it may frankly be said, indeed, that Hawthorne alone could have adequately portrayed his life for us, though in the same breath it should be added that the idea of his undertaking to do it is almost preposterous. To such a spirit as his, the plan would have had an exquisite absurdity about it, that might even have savored of imposition. The mass of trivial details essential to the accurate and consecutive account of an entire life could never have gained his serious attention. His modesty would have made as little of them as of boyish slate scribblings, full of significance, fun, and character to observers, but subjected to the sponge without a pang by their producer. There is something natural and fine in this. I confess that to me the spectacle presented by Goethe, when dwelling on the minutest incidents of his childhood with senile vanity and persistence, and fashioning with avaricious care the silver shrine and crystal case in which, like a very different sort of St. Charles Borromeo, he hopes to have the reverent ages view him, is one which increases my sense of his defective though splendid personality. and yet I cannot suppress the opposite feeling that the man of note who lets his riches of reminiscence be buried with him inflicts a loss on the world which it is hard to take resignedly. In the notebooks of Hawthorne, this want is to a large extent made good. His shrinking sensitivities in regard to the embalming process of biography is, in these, somewhat abated, so that they have been of incalculable use in assisting the popular eye to see him as he really was. Other material for illustration of his daily life is somewhat meagre, and yet, on one account, this is perhaps a cause for rejoicing. There is a halo about every man of large poetic genius which it is difficult for the world to wholly miss seeing while he is alive. Afterward, when the biographer comes, we find the actual dimensions, the physical outline, more insisted upon. That is the biographer's business, and it is not altogether his fault, though partly so, that the public regard is thus turned away from the peculiar but impalpable sign that floats above the poet's actual stature. But under this subtle influence, forgetting that old luminous hallucination, if it be one, we suddenly feel the want of it, are dissatisfied, and not perceiving that the cause lies largely with us, we fall to detracting from the subject. Thus it is fortunate that we have no regular biography of Shakespeare, authoritative enough to fade our own private conceptions of him. And it is not an unmixed ill that some degree of similar mystery should soften and give tone to the life of Hawthorne. Not that Hawthorne could ever be seriously disadvantaged by a complete record. For behind the greatness of the writer, in this case, there stands a person eminent for strength and loveliness, as few men are eminent in their private lives. But it is with dead authors, somewhat as it proved with those Etruscan warriors, who, seen through an eye-hole lying in perfect state within their tombs, crumbled to a powder when the sepulchres were opened. The contact of life and death is too unsympathetic. Whatever the stuff the writer be made of, it seems inevitable that he should suffer injury from exposure to the busy and prying light of subsequent life, after his so deep repose in death. "Would you have me a damned author?" exclaims Oberon in The Devil in Manuscript. "To undergo sneers, taunts, abuse, and cold neglect, and faint praise bestowed against the giver's conscience, an outlaw from the protection of the grave, one whose ashes every careless foot might spurn, unhonored in life, and remembered scornfully in death." This, to be sure, is a heated statement, in the mouth of a young author who is about to cast his unpublished works into the fire. But the dread expressed here is by no means unfounded. Even the publication of Hawthorne's notebooks has put it in the power of various writers of the day to assume an omniscience, not altogether just and far from acceptable. Why, then, should further risk of this be incurred by issuing the present work? It is precisely to put a limit to misconstructions, as well as to meet, however imperfectly, the desire of genuine appreciators, that it has been written. If this study for a portrait fulfills its aim, it will at least furnish an outline, fix a definite shape, within which whatever is observed by others may find its place with a truer effect and more fitting relation. The mistakes that have been made, indeed, are in no wise alarming ones, and it would be difficult to find any author who has been more carefully considered on the whole, or with such generally fair conclusions, as Hawthorne. Still, if one sees even minor distortions current, it can do no harm to correct them. Besides, there has as yet been no thorough attempt at a consistent synthetic portraiture, and the differences of different critics' estimates need some common ground to meet and be harmonized upon. If this can be supplied, there will be less waste of time in future studies of the same subject. It will be seen, therefore, that my book makes no pretension to the character of a life. The wish of Hawthorne on this point would alone be enough to prevent that. If such a work is to be undertaken, it should be by another hand, in which the right to set aside this wish is much more certainly vested than in mine. But I have thought that an earnest sympathy with the subject might sanction the present essay. Sympathy, after all, is the talisman which may preserve even the formal biographer from giving that injury to his theme just spoken of. And if the insight which guides me has any worth, it will present whatever material has already been made public with the selection and shaping which all researchers might not have time to bestow. Still, I am quite alive to the difficulties of my task, and I am conscious that the work may to some appear supererogatory. Stricture and praise are, it will perhaps be said, equally impertinent to a fame so well established. Neither have I any rash hope of adding a single ray to the light of Hawthorne's high standing. But I do not fear the charge of presumption. Time, if not the present reader, will supply the right perspective and proportion. On the ground of critical duty, there is surely defence enough for such an attempt as the one now offered. The relative rank of Hawthorne and other distinctions touching him seem to call for a fuller discussion than has been given them. I hope to prove, however, that my aim is in no wise a partisan one. Criticism is appreciative estimation. It is inevitable that the judgments of competent and cultivated persons should flatly contradict each other, as well as those of incompetent persons, and this whether they are coeval or of different dates. At the last, it is, in many respects, matter of simple individual impression, and there will always be persons of high intelligence whom it will be impossible to make coincide with us entirely, touching even a single author. So that the best we can do is to set about giving rational explanation of our diverse admirations. Others will explain theirs, and in this way, everything good having a fit showing, taste finds it easier to become catholic. Whoever reverences something has a meaning. Shall he not record it? But there are two ways in which he may express himself, through speech and through silence, both of them sacred alike. Which of these we will use on any given occasion is a question much too subtle, too surely fraught with intuitions that cannot be formulated, to admit of arbitrary prescription. In preferring here the form of speech, I feel that I have adopted only another kind of silence. End of A Study of Hawthorne, Chapter 1, Point of View, by George Parsons Lathrop.
El Tesoro Misterioso, capítulo 1. El desconocido de Manchester, por William Lequeux. Esta es una grabación para Librivox. Todas las grabaciones de Librivox están en el dominio público. Para más información o para ser voluntario, por favor visite librivox.org. Grabado por Claudia Barrett. ¡Muerto! ¡Y se ha llevado su secreto a la tumba! ¡Jamás! ¡Pero se lo ha llevado! ¡Mira! Tiene la quijada caída. ¿No ves el cambio, hombre? Entonces ha cumplido su amenaza después de todo. ¡La ha cumplido! Hemos sido unos tontos, Reginaldo, verdaderamente tontos, murmuré. Así parece. Confieso que yo esperaba confiadamente que nos diría la verdad cuando comprendiese que le había llegado el fin. Ah, tú no lo conocías como yo, observé con amargura. Tenía una voluntad de hierro y un nervio de acero, combinados con una constitución de caballo, porque si no, haría mucho tiempo que se hubiera muerto. Pero hemos sido engañados, completamente engañados por un moribundo. Nos ha desafiado, y hasta el último momento se ha burlado de nosotros. Blair no era un tonto, sabía lo que el conocimiento de esa verdad significaba para nosotros, una enorme fortuna. Lo que ha hecho sencillamente es guardar su secreto. Y dejarnos sin un centavo. Aunque hemos perdido miles, Gilberto, no puedo menos de admirar su tenaz determinación. Recuerdo que ha tenido que atravesar por momentos aciagos, y ha sido un buen amigo, pero muy bueno con nosotros. Por lo tanto, creo que no debemos abusar de él, aun cuando nos cause mucho sentimiento el hecho de que no nos haya dejado su secreto. Ah, si esos labios blancos pudiesen hablar, una sola palabra y los dos seríamos hombres ricos, exclamé con pena, contemplando la cara pálida del muerto, con sus ojos cerrados y su barba afeitada, que yacía sobre la almohada. Desde un principio su intención fue ocultar su secreto, observó cruzando los brazos mi amigo Reginaldo Seton, que estaba de pie al otro lado de la cama. No a todos los hombres les es dado conocer un descubrimiento como el suyo. Años ocupó para resolver el problema, cualquiera que fuese, pero no podemos dudar ni por un momento que consiguió su objeto. Y el beneficio que sacó fue más de 1.000.000 de libras esterlinas, agregué yo. Más bien 2, calculando por lo bajo. Recuerda que cuando por primera vez lo conocimos, pasaba las mayores estrecheces de dinero. Y ahora, en la semana pasada solamente, regaló 20,000 libras al fondo del hospital. Y todo esto lo debe haber podido resolver el enigma que hace tiempo nosotros nos esforzamos por descubrir. No, Gilberto, no ha procedido bien con nosotros. Debes acordarte que fuimos nosotros quienes le ayudamos, lo enderezamos y, en fin, hicimos todo lo que pudimos por él. Y en vez de revelarnos la clave del secreto que descubrió y lo colocó entre los hombres más ricos de Londres, se ha negado a hacerlo, a pesar de que sabía que iba a morir. Le prestamos dinero cuando su situación era precaria, le costeamos la educación de Mabel cuando él no tenía con qué pagarla y él nos pagó hasta el último centavo con intereses. Le interrumpí. Vamos, dejémonos de discutir aquí su proceder. El secreto se ha perdido para siempre, eso basta. Y cubrí con la sábana la cara del pobre muerto. El semblante de Burton Blair, el hombre que durante los últimos 5 años había sido uno de los misterios de Londres. Una vida extraña y aventurera, una carrera más notable que quizá muchas de esas que forjan los novelistas, se había cortado repentinamente. Mientras el secreto del origen de su enorme fortuna, secreto que ambos habíamos anhelado compartir durante los últimos 5 años, porque en cierto grado tenemos justos títulos para participar de sus ventajas, había desaparecido junto con él para nunca más volver. La pieza en que estábamos era un pequeño dormitorio bien amueblado del Queen's Hotel de Manchester. La ventana daba sobre la obscura fachada del hospital, y el ruido y bullicio del tráfico de Piccadilly ascendían hasta la habitación del muerto. Su historia era ciertamente una de las más extrañas que hombre alguno haya referido. Su misterio, como lo veremos, era verdaderamente pasmoso. La luz de aquella tarde triste de febrero desaparecía con rapidez, y al darnos vuelta lentamente para bajar e informar al gerente del establecimiento del fin desgraciado que había tenido un pasajero, noté que en un rincón estaba la maleta del muerto y las llaves colocadas en sus cerraduras. «Mejor es que tomemos posesión de ellas», observé, cerrando la maleta y poniendo en mi bolsillo el pequeño manojo de llaves. «Sus albaceas las necesitarán». Luego cerramos la puerta y, dirigiéndonos a la oficina, comunicamos la desagradable noticia de la muerte ocurrida en el hotel. El gerente estaba preparado, sin embargo, pues media hora antes el médico le había manifestado que el desconocido no tenía remedio. Desde el principio su enfermedad había sido un caso sin esperanza. He aquí, en breves palabras, lo que había sucedido. Burton Blair se había despedido de su hija Mabel, partiendo en la mañana del día anterior de su mansión de la plaza Grosvenor, para ir a tomar el expreso de las 10:30 que de Euston salía para Manchester, donde tenía que arreglar algunos negocios particulares, según había dicho. Antes que el tren llegara a Crewe, se sintió mal repentinamente, y uno de los sirvientes del coche-restaurant lo encontró desmayado en uno de los compartimientos de primera. Le dieron brandy y algunas otras bebidas reconfortantes que le hicieron revivir lo bastante para llegar hasta Manchester, donde le ayudaron a bajar del tren en London Road. Y 2 mozos del cordel lo subieron después a un cab y lo acompañaron al hotel. Una vez allí, al acostarlo, volvió a caer en un estado de completo desvanecimiento. Se llamó a un médico, pero no pudo emitir ningún diagnóstico sobre la enfermedad, contentándose con decir que el paciente tenía gravemente afectado el corazón y que, en vista de eso, el desenlace sería fatal y rápido. A las 2 de la mañana del día siguiente, Blair, que no había dado su nombre ni había manifestado quién era al agente del hotel, pidió que telegrafiaran a Seton y a mí, lo que dio por resultado que ambos, llenos de ansiedad y de sorpresa, nos pusiéramos en viaje para Manchester, a donde llegamos 1 hora antes del desenlace final, encontrándonos con que nuestro amigo estaba en un estado desesperante. Al entrar en la pieza nos encontramos con el médico, un tal Dr. Glenn, hombre joven y más bien agradable, que estaba asistiéndolo. Blair se hallaba en ese momento completamente consciente y escuchó la opinión médica sin alterarse. En verdad parecía que acogía con gusto la muerte en vez de temerla, pues cuando oyó que se encontraba en tan crítica situación, una débil sonrisa se dibujó en su pálida cara arrugada y observó: «Todos tenemos que morir, así que lo mismo da que sea hoy que mañana». Luego, volviéndose a mí, añadió: «Ha sido mucha bondad en usted, Gilberto, venir expresamente a despedirse. Y alargó su delgada mano fría, buscó la mía y la estrechó fuertemente, mientras sus ojos se clavaban en mí con una extraña mirada fija, que sólo aparece en los ojos de un hombre cuando se encuentra al borde de la tumba. «Es el deber de un amigo, Burton», respondí con profunda solemnidad. «Pero todavía puede tener esperanza. Los médicos se equivocan a menudo. ¿No tiene usted acaso una espléndida constitución?» «Desde que era muy chico, no recuerdo haber estado casi un solo día enfermo», contestó el millonario en voz baja y débil. «Pero este ataque me ha vencido completamente». Tratamos de cerciorarnos con exactitud de cómo se había enfermado, pero ni Reginaldo ni el doctor pudieron sacar nada en claro. «Perdí el conocimiento de pronto y no recuerdo nada más», fue todo lo que el moribundo dijo. «Pero», añadió volviéndose otra vez a mí, «no avisen a Mabel hasta que todo haya terminado. Pobre criatura. Mi única pena al irme de este mundo es tener que dejarla. Ustedes dos fueron en los años pasados sumamente buenos con ella. ¿No es verdad que ahora no la abandonarán?», imploró hablando lentamente y con grandísima dificultad, mientras sus ojos brillaban llenos de lágrimas. «Ciertamente que no, viejo amigo», contesté yo. «Viéndose sola, necesitará de alguien que la aconseje y se ocupe de sus intereses». «Los pillos de los abogados se encargarán de eso», exclamó con una extraña dureza en su voz, como si no hubiera tenido estimación alguna por sus abogados. «No, quiero que usted vele por ella, que se cuide de que ningún hombre la haga su esposa por amor a su dinero. ¿Me comprende? Docenas de individuos andan en este momento detrás de ella, lo sé, pero preferiría antes verla muerta que casada con uno de ellos. Debe casarse por amor. Sí, por amor. ¿Me oye? Prométame, Gilberto, que la protegerá, que velará por su suerte. ¿Quiere?» Reteniendo todavía su mano entre las mías, le prometí cumplir lo que me pedía. Estas fueron las últimas palabras que pronunció. Sus pálidos labios se contrajeron de nuevo, pero no brotó de ellos ningún sonido. Sus ojos vidriosos estaban fijos en mí con una mirada terrible y dura, como si hubiera estado esforzándose por decirme algo. Tal vez me estaba revelando el gran secreto, el secreto de cómo había resuelto el misterio de hacer fortuna y de poseer más de 1.000.000 de libras esterlinas. O tal vez me hablaba de Mabel, pero nosotros no pudimos saber lo que fue. Su lengua se negaba a articular una palabra más. El silencio de la muerte habíase apoderado de él. Así desapareció de este mundo, y así fue como yo me encontré ligado a una promesa que tenía la intención de cumplir, aun cuando él no nos había revelado su secreto, como nosotros confiadamente lo habíamos esperado. Cuando nos mandó llamar, habíamos creído que, dándose cuenta de su estado agonizante, lo hacía para darnos a conocer ese misterioso medio que nos haría más ricos de lo que jamás habíamos soñado. Pero en este caso el desengaño había sido cruelísimo. Durante 5 años, lo confieso, habíamos esperado confiados en que algún día repartiría con nosotros parte de su fortuna en compensación de los servicios que le habíamos hecho en lo pasado. Sin embargo, parecía ahora que fríamente había despreciado la deuda de gratitud que tenía para con nosotros, y al mismo tiempo me había impuesto a mí una obligación no muy fácil de cumplir, la tutela de Mabel, su única hija. Fin de El Tesoro Misterioso, capítulo 1, El desconocido de Manchester, por William Le Queux. Grabado por Claudia Barrett.
Des Kindes Willen, Kapitel 1, von Curtis York, übersetzt von Emmy Becher. Dies ist eine Librivox-Aufnahme. Alle Librivox-Aufnahmen sind lizenzfrei und in öffentlichem Besitz. Weitere Informationen und Hinweise zur Beteiligung an diesem Projekt gibt es bei librivox.org. Gelesen von Availle im Juli 2015. Des Kindes Willen, erstes Kapitel. Er hatte sie schon öfters auf der Treppe bemerkt, ein kleines Dingelchen mit welligen Haaren und sanften braunen Augen. Heute redete er sie zum ersten Mal im Vorübergehen an und strich ihr mit der Hand über die Haare. Sie blieb stehen und schaute zu ihm auf. 5 Jahre alt heute, sagte sie ernsthaft mit einem Stimmchen, das selbst für ein Kind besonders hell und weich klang. Es ist mein Geburtstag. 5 Jahre alt, wiederholte er feierlich, denn er war heute in außergewöhnlich guter Laune. Eben hatte er von einem Kunsthändler die Nachricht erhalten, dass eines seiner Bilder verkauft sei, und das bedeutete ihm fast einen Lebensabschnitt, nicht nur ein freudiges Ereignis. 5 Jahre alt, allen Respekt. Hast du denn auch 5 Geschenke gekriegt? Das Persönchen schüttelte den Kopf. Nein, nicht einziges. Pa hat's vergessen, erwiderte sie. Ob ich wohl irgendetwas habe, das für einen 5-jährigen Geburtstag passt? Sagte Jocelyn gutmütig. Wollen wir einmal nachsehen? Das Kind schob sofort ihr Händchen in die seinige. Es war ein kleines, eiskaltes Händchen und bedeutend magerer, als sich's für einen 5-jährigen Geburtstag geziemt hätte. Ja, nachsehen. Heiße Dot, fügte sie vertraulich hinzu. Und du? Jocelyn stellte sich ihr vor, und sie traten in sein Atelier. »Was für komische Stube«, rief sie auf der Schwelle mit einem kleinen Freudensprung. »Und so groß. Und ein Feuer hast dich. Ich muß aber reich sein.« Lachend begann er in einem alten, eingelegten Schrank neben dem Kamin herumzukramen. »Wir wohnen mehr Treppen hoch«, fuhr sie fort. »Und Feuer haben wir keins. Kriegen aber eins, wenn Pa reich wird und nicht kurios ist.« Jocelyn konnte sich ungefähr vorstellen, worin Pas Kuriosität bestünde, denn seine Wirtin hatte ihm wiederholt erzählt, dass der Herr vom 4. sich mit möglichster Geschwindigkeit zu Tode trinke. Armes Seelchen, dachte er mit einem Blick auf das winzige Frauenzimmerchen, das wollüstig die Finger wärmend vor seinem Kaminfeuer hockte. Dabei fiel ihm ein, dass es sich wohl verlohnen würde, das seltsame, unregelmäßige Gesichtchen unter dem Wald von ungebärdigen Locken zu malen, nicht der Schönheit, aber der Besonderheit wegen. »Nun, was meinst du zu diesem Halsband?« fragte er, eine Schnur hellblauer Glasperlen aus der Schublade ziehend, die am Hals seines vorletzten Modells als Geschmeide einer orientalischen Fürstin geprangt hatte. Würde das nicht ein hübsches Geburtstagsgeschenk abgeben? Oder gefällt dir das besser? Dabei hielt er, einem plötzlichen Einfall gehorchend, ein Bronzefigürchen in die Höhe, die schlanke Gestalt einer zierlichen Nymphe, die, aufwärts schwebend, nur mit der äußersten Fußspitze am Boden haftete. »Oh, Engel, bitte schön«, flüsterte das Kind, ohne einen Blick für die Glasperlen zu haben, ganz atemlos vor Entzücken. Sie war fast schön in ihrer Verklärung, als sie zart und vorsichtig die Figur in ihre Händchen nahm, sie streichelte, küsste und wie ein lebendiges Wesen herzte. Höchlich ergötzt beobachtete er sie. »Warum hältst du das für einen Engel?« lachte er. »Ist's keiner?« fragte die Kleine. »Sieht aus wie ein Engel. Kann mich's nicht ein Engel heißen?« »Aus Nymphen Engel zu machen, ist etwas beschwerlich«, warf Jocelyn grimmig hin. Nymphe, wiederholte Dot, die zarten Augenbrauen zusammenziehend. Ist's hübscher, sich eine Nymphe sein als ein Engel? Jedenfalls kommt's häufiger vor, Dot. Diese hier ist eine tanzende Nymphe, und wahrscheinlich ist sie nicht sehr engelhaft gewesen. Tanzt's? Fragte Dot gespannten Blicks. Tanze auch? Mich? Soll mich? Jawohl, wenn's dir Spaß macht, versetzte der Maler, indem er sich aufs Sofa warf und eine Zigarette ansteckte. Dot stellte ihr Heiligtum vorsichtig weg, rückte in geschäftsmäßiger Weise einige Stühle beiseite, zog ihre ausgetretenen Schuhe von den Füßen und begann zu tanzen. »Dich mußt pfeifen«, gebot sie mit herrischem Nicken. Gehorsam pfiff Jocelyn eine bekannte Walzermelodie. »Donnerwetter«, rief er nach ein paar Minuten, »das tanzt ja wie ein richtiges Feenkind. Wer hat's dich denn gelehrt, du kleiner Kobold?« »Mutter, aber...« »Psst«, erklärte sie, den Finger an die Lippen drückend. »Pa mag's nicht mehr leiden, wenn mich tanzt, und von Mutters Bechen soll mich auch nicht.« »Ist sie gestorben?« fragte Jocelyn. »Glaube. Krank ist sie geworden und hat sich nicht mehr ausgehen können, und dann hat sich im Bett bleiben müssen und dann ganz still gelegen, und Pa sagt, sie sei tot. Da haben wir geweint, der Pa und mich, und dann hat man's in langen Kasten gelegt und fortgetragen. Dann haben wir in diesem Haus gewohnt und Pa ist kurios geworden. Aber ist nicht immer kurios, mußt ich wissen«, fügte sie begütigend hinzu. »Ist sich ein lieber, guter Pa, der mich manchmal auf seinem Knie sitzen lässt und mir Geschichten erzählt.« »Ob dein Pa mir wohl auch erlauben würde, dich zu malen?« fragte Jocelyn. Das kleine Ding starrte ihn verdutzt an. »Ob er mir erlauben wird, ein Bild von dir zu malen, meine ich.« »Weiß mich nicht«, versetzte Dot zweifelnd. »Wollen wir ihn einmal fragen?« »Pa ist ausgangen. Würdest mich hübsch sein lassen auf dein Bild?« Sie sah ihm prüfend in die Augen, und er nickte. Das kleine elfenartige Geschöpfchen war merkwürdig kameradschaftlich. »Zeig mir mal deine Bilder«, befahl sie, dicht an ihn herantretend und ihn an einem Finger fassend. Er führte sie im Atelier umher, wobei er vorsichtig die für ihren Blick ungeeigneten Pinseleien nach der Wand kehrte, bis sie plötzlich eine seiner Lieblingsstudien ins Auge fasste, ehe ihm Zeit für diese Vorsichtsmaßregel geblieben war. »Oh, bitte, bitte mach kein Bild von mir, das nicht Kleider anhat«, rief sie unbeschreiblich flehend. »Nein, nein, ganz gewiss nicht.« Darüber beruhigt ging sie feierlich von einer Leinwand zur anderen, blieb vor jeder stehen, wie es nur irgendein Kenner gemacht hätte, runzelte die Stirne und presste die Lippen fest aufeinander. Endlich erklärte sie mit einer Bestimmtheit und Endgültigkeit, die ihn höchlich ergötzte: »Mag deine Bilder nicht.« »Wahrhaftig, Frauenzimmerchen«, rief er gutmütig auflachend. »Und warum nicht?« »Weil garstig sind«, lautete das unverblümte Urteil. »Und alle Gesichter haben eine komische Farbe. Mag mein Gesicht mich nicht so komisch gemalt haben?« »Du bist wirklich ein gelungener kleiner Kerl«, bemerkte er sie von der Seite ansehend. »Kann mich Peter dabei haben?« erkundigte sie sich plötzlich. »Darf mich Peter auf Schoß setzen? Er ist ganz, ganz klein«, setzte sie überredend hinzu. »Kaum wird man ihn sehen auf dem Bild, und mich hab ihn so lieb.« »Peter? Wer in aller Welt ist denn dieser Peter?« »Meine Katze«, lautete die in wehmütigem Tone gegebene Antwort. »Hat nur ein Auge, armes Ding, aber mich hat Peter so lieb, so lieb.« Sie brach plötzlich ab, und das kleine Gesicht nahm den Ausdruck gespanntester Erwartung an, worein sich deutlich ausgesprochene Angst mischte. Jetzt hörte auch der Maler die Haustüre zufallen, rasche Fußtritte erklangen auf der Treppe, und das Gesicht der Kleinen war wie durch einen Zauberschlag verwandelt. Sie riss die Zimmertüre auf und rief jubelnd hinaus: »Pa, Pa, komm und besuch den Malherrn, er will mich in ein Bild machen.« Jocelyn trat hinaus und stand einem hochgewachsenen Mann von etlichen 50 Jahren, mit verlebtem, aber gutartigem Gesicht, freundlichen, aber blutunterlaufenen Augen gegenüber. Er war leider Gottes ein Wrack, aber das Wrack eines anständigen Menschen. »Herr Fraser, soviel ich weiß«, sagte der Maler, sich artig verbeugend. Dodds Paar erwiderte die Verbeugung mit gewinnendem Lächeln. »Sehr angenehm, Herr Jocelyn. Freut mich, Sie kennenzulernen. Sie hätten Lust, meine kleine wilde Hummel zu malen? Das leuchtet dir wohl sehr ein, Dodd, oder nicht?« Sie nickte. »Mich jetzt nach Peter sehen will«, erklärte sie. »Mich kommt bald wieder.« Ende von des Kindes Willen, Kapitel 1 von Curtis York. Übersetzt von Emmy Becher.
Wieland, or The Transformation, An American Tale. Chapter 1, by Charles Brockden Brown. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bruce Kachuk. I feel little reluctance in complying with your request. You know not fully the cause of my sorrows. You are a stranger to the depth of my distresses, hence your efforts at consolation must necessarily fail. Yet the tale that I am going to tell is not intended as a claim upon your sympathy. In the midst of my despair, I do not disdain to contribute what little I can to the benefit of mankind. I acknowledge your right to be informed of the events that have lately happened in my family. Make what use of the tale you shall think proper. If it be communicated to the world, it will inculcate the duty of avoiding deceit. It will exemplify the force of early impressions and show the immeasurable evils that flow from an erroneous or imperfect discipline. My state is not destitute of tranquillity. The sentiment that dictates my feelings is not hope. Futurity has no power over my thoughts. To all that is to come I am perfectly indifferent. With regard to myself, I have nothing more to fear. Fate has done its worst. Henceforth I am callous to misfortune. I address no supplication to the deity. The power that governs the course of human affairs has chosen his path. The decree that ascertained the condition of my life admits of no recall. No doubt it squares with the maxims of eternal equity. That is neither to be questioned nor denied by me. It suffices that the past is exempt from mutation. The storm that tore up our happiness, and changed into dreariness and desert the blooming scene of our existence, is lulled into grim repose, but not until the victim was transfixed and mangled, till every obstacle was dissipated by its rage, till every remnant of good was wrested from our grasp and exterminated. How will your wonder, and that of your companions, be excited by my story? Every sentiment will yield to your amazement. If my testimony were without corroborations, you would reject it as incredible. The experience of no human being can furnish a parallel. That I, beyond the rest of mankind, should be reserved for a destiny without alleviation, and without example. Listen to my narrative, and then say what it is that has made me deserve to be placed on this dreadful eminence. If indeed every faculty be not suspended in wonder that I am still alive, and am able to relate it. My father's ancestry was noble on the paternal side, but his mother was the daughter of a merchant. My grandfather was a younger brother, and a native of Saxony. He was placed, when he had reached the suitable age, at a German college. During the vacations he employed himself in traversing the neighboring territory. On one occasion it was his fortune to visit Hamburg. He formed an acquaintance with Leonard Weiss, a merchant of that city, and was a frequent guest at his house. The merchant had an only daughter, for whom his guest speedily contracted an affection, and in spite of parental menaces and prohibitions, he, in due season, became her husband. By this act he mortally offended his relations. Thenceforward he was entirely disowned and rejected by them. They refused to contribute anything to his support. All intercourse ceased, and he received from them merely that treatment to which an absolute stranger or detested enemy would be entitled. He found an asylum in the house of his new father, whose temper was kind and whose pride was flattered by this alliance. The nobility of his birth was put in the balance against his poverty. Vice conceived himself, on the whole, to have acted with the highest discretion in thus disposing of his child. My grandfather found it incumbent on him to search out some mode of independent subsistence. His youth had been eagerly devoted to literature and music. These had hitherto been cultivated merely as sources of amusement. They were now converted into the means of gain. At this period there were few works of taste in the Saxon dialect. My ancestor may be considered as the founder of the German theatre. The modern poet of the same name is sprung from the same family, and perhaps surpasses but little in the fruitfulness of his invention or the soundness of his taste, the elder Wieland. His life was spent in the composition of sonatas and dramatic pieces. They were not unpopular, but merely afforded him a scanty subsistence. He died in the bloom of his life, and was quickly followed to the grave by his wife. Their only child was taken under the protection of the merchant. At an early age he was apprenticed to a London trader, and passed 7 years of mercantile servitude. My father was not fortunate in the character of him under whose care he was now placed. He was treated with rigor, and full employment was provided for every hour of his time. His duties were laborious and mechanical. He had been educated with a view to this profession, and therefore was not tormented with unsatisfied desires. He did not hold his present occupations in abhorrence, because they withheld him from paths more flowery and more smooth, but he found in unintermitted labor, and in the sternness of his master, sufficient occasions for discontent. No opportunities of recreation were allowed him. He spent all his time pent up in a gloomy apartment, or traversing narrow and crowded streets. His food was coarse, and his lodging humble. His heart gradually contracted a habit of morose and gloomy reflection. He could not accurately define what was wanting to his happiness. He was not tortured by comparisons drawn between his own situation and that of others. His state was such as suited his age and his views as to fortune. He did not imagine himself treated with extraordinary or unjustifiable rigor. In this respect, he supposed the condition of others, bound like himself to mercantile service, to resemble his own. Yet every engagement was irksome, and every hour tedious in its lapse. In this state of mind he chanced to light upon a book written by one of the teachers of the Albigenses, or French Protestants. He entertained no relish for books, and was wholly unconscious of any power they possessed to delight or instruct. This volume had lain for years in a corner of his garret, half buried in dust and rubbish. He had marked it as it lay, had thrown it, as his occasions required, from one spot to another, but had felt no inclination to examine its contents, or even to inquire what was the subject of which it treated. One Sunday afternoon, being induced to retire for a few minutes to his garret, his eye was attracted by a page of this book, which, by some accident, had been opened and placed full in his view. He was seated on the edge of his bed, and was employed in repairing a rent in some part of his clothes. His eyes were not confined to his work, but occasionally wandering, lighted at length upon the page. The words, "Seek, and ye shall find," were those that first offered themselves to his notice. His curiosity was roused by these so far as to prompt him to proceed. As soon as he finished his work, he took up the book and turned to the first page. The further he read, the more inducement he found to continue, and he regretted the decline of the light which obliged him for the present to close it. The book contained an exposition of the doctrine of the sect of Camisards, and an historical account of its origin. His mind was in a state peculiarly fitted for the reception of devotional sentiments. The craving which had haunted him was now supplied with an object. His mind was at no loss for a theme of meditation. On days of business he rose at the dawn, and retired to his chamber not till late at night. He now supplied himself with candles, and employed his nocturnal and Sunday hours in studying this book. It, of course, abounded with allusions to the Bible. All its conclusions were deduced from the sacred text. This was the fountain, beyond which it was unnecessary to trace the stream of religious truth, but it was his duty to trace it thus far. A Bible was easily procured, and he ardently entered on the study of it. His understanding had received a particular direction. All his reveries were fashioned in the same mould. His progress towards the formation of his creed was rapid. Every fact and sentiment in this book were viewed through a medium which the writings of the Camisard apostle had suggested. His constructions of the text were hasty and formed on a narrow scale. Everything was viewed in a disconnected position. One action and one precept were not employed to illustrate and restrict the meaning of another. Hence arose 1,000 scruples to which he had hitherto been a stranger. He was alternately agitated by fear and by ecstasy. He imagined himself beset by the snares of a spiritual foe, and that his security lay in ceaseless watchfulness and prayer. His morals, which had never been loose, were now modelled by a stricter standard. The empire of religious duty extended itself to his looks, gestures, and phrases. All levities of speech and negligences of behaviour were proscribed. His air was mournful and contemplative. He laboured to keep alive a sentiment of fear and a belief of the all-creating presence of the Deity. Ideas foreign to this were sedulously excluded. To suffer their intrusion was a crime against the divine majesty inexpiable but by days and weeks of the keenest agonies. No material variation had occurred in the lapse of 2 years. Every day confirmed him in his present modes of thinking and acting. It was to be expected that the tide of his emotions would sometimes recede, that intervals of despondency and doubt would occur, but these gradually were more rare and of shorter duration, and he at last arrived at a state considerably uniform in this respect. His apprenticeship was now almost expired. On his arrival of age he became entitled, by the will of my grandfather, to a small sum. This sum would hardly suffice to set him afloat as a trader in his present situation, and he had nothing to expect from the generosity of his master. Residence in England had, besides, become almost impossible on account of his religious tenets. In addition to these motives for seeking a new habitation, there was another of the most imperious and irresistible necessity. He had imbibed an opinion that it was his duty to disseminate the truths of the gospel among the unbelieving nations. He was terrified at first by the perils and hardships to which the life of a missionary is exposed. This cowardice made him diligent in the invention of objections and excuses, but he found it impossible wholly to shake off the belief that such was the injunction of his duty. The belief, after every new conflict with his passions, acquired new strength, and at length he formed a resolution of complying with what he deemed the will of heaven. The North American Indians naturally presented themselves as the first objects for this species of benevolence. As soon as his servitude expired, he converted his little fortune into money, and embarked for Philadelphia. Here his fears were revived, and a nearer survey of savage manners once more shook his resolution. For a while he relinquished his purpose, and purchasing a farm on Schuylkill, within a few miles of the city, set himself down to the cultivation of it. The cheapness of land and the service of African slaves, which were then in general use, gave him who was poor in Europe all the advantages of wealth. He passed 14 years in a thrifty and laborious manner. In this time new objects, new employments, and new associates appeared to have nearly obliterated the devout impressions of his youth. He now became acquainted with a woman of a meek and quiet disposition, and of slender acquirements like himself. He proffered his hand, and was accepted. His previous industry had now enabled him to dispense with personal labor, and direct attention to his own concerns. He enjoyed leisure, and was visited afresh by devotional contemplation. The reading of the Scriptures and other religious books became once more his favorite employment. His ancient belief relative to the conversion of the savage tribes was revived with uncommon energy. To the former obstacles were now added the pleadings of parental and conjugal love. The struggle was long and vehement, but his sense of duty would not be stifled or enfeebled, and finally triumphed over every impediment. His efforts were attended with no permanent success. His exhortations had sometimes a temporary power, but more frequently were repelled with insult and derision. In pursuit of this object he encountered the most imminent perils, and underwent incredible fatigues, hunger, sickness, and solitude. the license of savage passion, and the artifices of his depraved countrymen all opposed themselves to his progress. His courage did not forsake him till there appeared no reasonable ground to hope for success. He desisted not till his heart was relieved from the supposed obligation to persevere. With his constitution somewhat decayed, he at length returned to his family. An interval of tranquillity succeeded. He was frugal, regular, and strict in the performance of domestic duties. He allied himself with no sect, because he perfectly agreed with none. Social worship is that by which they are all distinguished, but this article found no place in his creed. He rigidly interpreted that precept which enjoins us, when we worship, to retire into solitude, and shut out every species of society. According to him, devotion was not only a silent office, but must be performed alone. An hour at noon and an hour at midnight were thus appropriated. At the distance of 300 yards from his house, on the top of a rock whose sides were steep, rugged, and encumbered with dwarf cedars and stony asperities, he built what to a common eye would have seemed a summer house. The eastern verge of this precipice was 60 feet above the river which flowed at its foot. The view before it consisted of a transparent current fluctuating and rippling in a rocky channel, and bounded by a rising scene of cornfields and orchards. The edifice was slight and airy. It was no more than a circular area 12 feet in diameter, whose flooring was the rock cleared of moss and shrubs and exactly levelled, edged by 12 Tuscan columns and covered by an undulating dome. My father furnished the dimensions and outlines, but allowed the artist whom he employed to complete the structure on his own plan. It was without seat, table, or ornament of any kind. This was the temple of his deity. Twice in 24 hours he repaired hither, unaccompanied by any human being. Nothing but physical inability to move was allowed to obstruct or postpone this visit. He did not exact from his family compliance with his example. Few men, equally sincere in their faith, were as sparing in their censures and restrictions with respect to the conduct of others as my father. The character of my mother was no less devout, but her education had habituated her to a different mode of worship. The loneliness of their dwelling prevented her from joining any established congregation, but she was punctual in the offices of prayer and in the performance of hymns to her Saviour, after the manner of the disciples of Zinzendorf. My father refused to interfere in her arrangements. His own system was embraced not, accurately speaking, because it was the best, but because it had been expressly prescribed to him. Other modes, if practiced by other persons, might be equally acceptable. His deportment to others was full of charity and mildness. A sadness perpetually overspread his features, but was unmingled with sternness or discontent. The tones of his voice, his gestures, his steps were all in tranquil unison. His conduct was characterized by a certain forbearance and humility, which secured the esteem of those to whom his tenets were most obnoxious. They might call him a fanatic and a dreamer, but they could not deny their veneration to his invincible candor and invariable integrity. His own belief of rectitude was the foundation of his happiness. This, however, was destined to find an end. Suddenly the sadness that constantly attended him was deepened. Sighs and even tears sometimes escaped him. To the expostulations of his wife he seldom answered anything. When he designed to be communicative, he hinted that his peace of mind was flown, in consequence of deviation from his duty. A command had been laid upon him which he had delayed to perform. He felt as if a certain period of hesitation and reluctance had been allowed him, but that this period was past. He was no longer permitted to obey. The duty assigned to him was transferred, in consequence of his disobedience, to another, and all that remained was to endure the penalty. He did not describe this penalty. It appeared to be nothing more for some time than a sense of wrong. This was sufficiently acute, and was aggravated by the belief that his offence was incapable of expiation. No one could contemplate the agonies which he seemed to suffer without the deepest compassion. Time, instead of lightening the burthen, appeared to add to it. At length he hinted to his wife that his end was near. His imagination did not prefigure the mode or the time of his decease, but was fraught with an incurable persuasion that his death was at hand. He was likewise haunted by the belief that the kind of death that awaited him was strange and terrible. His anticipations were thus far vague and indefinite, but they sufficed to poison every moment of his being, and devote him to ceaseless anguish. End of Wieland, or The Transformation, An American Tale, Chapter 1, by Charles Brockden Brown.